April 30, 2016 ATB, Forward Operating Base Edmond, Asahi, Toyama Prefecture. When Corporal Kururugi Suzuku, along with the rest of his freshly replenished battalion, had been deployed to Toyama Prefecture 3 weeks earlier, the food had been a pleasant surprise. The typical pots of grey, unidentifiable meat swimming in watery broth had not accompanied the 3rd Regiment, and the boxes of dehydrated crap rations typically issued to formations in the field had been left behind in their home barracks in the Tokyo settlement. Instead, the newly minted corporal and the rest of his unit had eaten extravagantly, at least by Area 11 standards, since they had taken up their posts on the prefectural border with Niigata. Back before the conquest, Toyama had been famous for its seafood, thanks to the seemingly endless bounty of Toyama Bay. Indeed, in a past life, a young Suzuku had dined upon fresh yellowtail that arrived at the Kururugi Shrine on ice, straight from Toyama. Toyama black ramen, with its fatty pork and its deliciously salty broth, had been a special treat reserved for meals after kendo tournaments. Now, he sat with the rest of his fire team in a dilapidated sports center that had been redesignated as Forward Operating Base Edmond, eating pickled squid straight out of brining jars and grilling trout with the rest of the company over a number of charcoal grills that the prefect's liaison team had so helpfully provided. Despite the surprisingly good food, morale was low among the men of His Imperial Majesty's 32nd Honorary Britannian Legion. The lack of lunchtime conversation could be chalked up to the age-old military custom of eating while food is available. There was, after all, no guarantee that the food would still be there when your conversation finished. Corporal Kururugi was certain that many of the men squatting around the grills scattered about the old basketball court had nothing but the food in front of them on their minds, especially since they would be boarding the buses back to Tokyo after lunch. Nobody was stupid enough to think that quality seafood would still be freely available once they were back in the settlement. He was just as certain that the men who sat staring blankly into their soup bowls instead of eating were lost in their fresh new memories of Toyama. They had the mien of haunted men. Corporal Kururugi recognized those hollow eyes from the mirror. He was certain that they were full of the fervent hope that their new ghosts wouldn't follow them back to the settlement. He'd long since ceased to hope that his own personal ghost would be so accommodating. Corporal Kururugi realized his thoughts were drifting, and forced himself away from thoughts of the past with a wrench. He'd lately been having trouble staying focused on the present himself. Something about being out in Toyama, where the influence of Britannia was lighter and which still bore such a resemblance to the Javi Area 11 that Kururugi remembered from his youth, made it difficult to keep his focus where it belonged, on the future. Many things would change once they returned to the settlement, seafood being the least of them. Unless the climate in Tokyo had changed, the men would be confined to base once again upon arrival. Instead of the prefect's generous approach towards outfitting soldiers with all the bits and bobs they needed, the men would have to get used to paying through the nose for their own kit once more. More importantly, Corporal Kururugi very much doubted that the 3 battalions of honorary Britannian soldiers would be permitted to keep the pistols they had been issued after arriving in Toyama City. While it was typically the policy of Prince Clovis's administration to not permit its honorary Britannian units access to lethal weapons, the situation in neighboring Niigata Prefecture had all but forced the Britannians to properly equip its slave soldiers. Besides the pistols, Corporal Kururugi's battalion had been issued new boots, fresh uniforms, and bulletproof vests during their time in the prefecture, amazingly without any handling fees charged to the soldiers. Hopefully the Britannians will at least let us keep the first 2 items, Corporal Kururugi thought. Don't think they'd want uniforms that stink like 11's back, not to mention the boots. The Toyama deployment had been as grueling as it was brief. Officially, the 3rd Regiment and its sister regiments of the 1st Brigade had been dispatched to the area where Toyama, Niigata, and Nagano prefectures met as part of a larger stabilization effort, aimed at combating the banditry of stubborn 11 rebels and ungrateful peasants. Unofficially, the prefect of Toyama had allegedly begged the area administration for any available units that could be sent to his dominion, desperate to keep the burgeoning peasant rebellion from expanding south out of Niigata, towards his own fiefdom. The prefect had even gone as far as promising to supply any deployed units from his own discretionary budget. The administration, always eager to free up funding for whichever grand developments the vice-regal governor dreamed up, had jumped at the opportunity. Which was how elements of the 32nd Honorary Britannian Legion, Corporal Kururugi included, had found themselves practically drowning in fresh seafood while occupying the northern region of Toyama Prefecture, practically within sight of the Niigata border. Why the people of Niigata had risen with such incandescent fury was beyond Corporal Kururugi. Lots of rumors had swirled around the battalion, of course, but the scuttlebutt had yet to reach any consensus. The two top contenders had been that a particularly hated Britannian landlord had stolen an 11 bride away from the altar to enjoy the honeymoon himself, or that one of the more professional rebel units had managed to briefly take over a radio station and had broadcast a call to arms before blowing up both the radio station and themselves. Of the two, Corporal Kururugi was putting his money on the latter option. While the former was a better story, such events simply happened too often in Area 11 to cause this level of violence. Ultimately, it didn't matter which story was true, if either of them were. All over Niigata, honorary Britannian policemen and officials had been murdered. Some, the lucky ones, were publicly lynched from trees and lampposts. The others burnt to death along with their families, all the while fruitlessly beating down on their doors and windows that had been nailed shut and barricaded from the outside. At least, those had been among the many claims regarding ongoing events in Niigata made by the Britannian lieutenant who had briefed Corporal Kururugi's company, bristling with anger over the insult offered by the impertinent 11s. If even a tenth of the officer's claims had been true, Corporal Kururugi could easily imagine the fury of the Britannian punitive reprisals in Niigata itself. After all, Kururugi felt just the same when he let himself contemplate the bitter irony that both his former countrymen and his adopted fellow citizens had no problem stringing men like himself up from lampposts and trees. While at least some of Niigata's inhabitants had chosen to stand and fight a doomed defense of their homes, plenty more had fled the violence, running in any direction they could as long as it was away from the bloodshed. This initial rush of refugees had panicked the prefect of Toyama. The refugees were stripping fields and depots bare of any supplies they could and were inhibiting the productivity of the 11 serfs slaving away in the northern part of the prefecture. Worse, the refugees were bringing word of the conflict to those local serfs, potentially inspiring yet more rebellious behavior. Worse still, the prefect had apparently reasoned, it was all but certain that insurgents were hidden in the hopeless crowd, guaranteeing the spread of the uprising outside of Niigata's boundaries. After all, an ambush had been attempted on a Britannian convoy in Nagano, and even though it had been crushed, it was a potential sign of things to come. Ultimately, that chain of events had led to the stabilization mission, and the 1st Brigade's deployment order was to be maintained at any cost. And that order had been maintained by setting up armed checkpoints on every major road, installing strong fortifications along the prefecture's border, and of particular relevance to Corporal Kururugi, the sweeping missions. Each day, Corporal Kururugi's platoon had been given the name of a village and a copy of the official census for that village. Individuals who had been marked out for whatever reason as subjects of special concern had been highlighted in red, while the names of all men of fighting age, 12 to 60, and women between the ages of 14 and 30 had been underlined in green. Papers in hand, the platoon would rendezvous with a squad of Britannian military police from the Toyama garrison and make their way to the targeted village, 2 or 3 empty trucks tagging along behind their convoy of 4 truckloads of soldiers and 2 police cars. The trucks never returned empty, though. Corporal Kururugi had made a name for himself over the last 4 months since Christmas as a diligent soldier, always willing to go the extra mile for his Britannian commanders. He had done everything in his power to ensure that the targets his squad had been tasked with finding had ended up in those trucks, pushing the 4 men of the fire team under his command to scour the village for suspicious characters, even if they weren't marked in red on their list. Suzuki hated it all, and hated himself for his complicity. It was all in service of what he had taken to thinking of as the plan, but that was cold comfort when Corporal Kururugi had to beat a mother half to death with a baton to stop her from interfering as his fire team loaded her 13-year-old son onto the waiting truck. The fact that Suzuki knew that he would almost certainly have to do far worse to guarantee the plan's success only twisted the knife further. After the scales had fallen from his eyes as he stared up at the charred thing that had once been a comrade, Suzuki had thought long and hard about his next moves. It was obvious in retrospect that the image he had been sold when enlisting of the Empire and his place within it as an honorary Britannian was a lie. Less obvious was how he could turn that lie into some form of truth. It was easy to say that a new leader had to be appointed to reform the system, but how could that lofty goal be accomplished? The first steps were small and incremental. Carefully, Quietly, Suzaku had taken the emotional temperature of his battalion, trying to figure out how his fellow honorary Britannians were taking the events of what had already been dubbed the Christmas incident. To his shock, Suzaku found that while most of the men were angry, few felt betrayed. This led to an uncomfortable moment of self-realization. Suzaku had believed in the Britannians and their marketing, and had assumed that all of his fellow soldiers felt likewise. In this belief, Suzaku had been wrong. Unfortunately, this skepticism of Britannian claims had actually insulated the other soldiers against the horrors of Christmas. They had all seemingly expected little better from Britannians, and were merely angry and sad to be proven correct. Few shared the white-hot rage pulsing through him, and the ones who felt the same as he did had no idea how to conceal their anger. While Suzaku's childhood friend might have appreciated these angry men as pawns, Suzaku didn't have the luxury to think in anything but the long term, and association with obvious malcontents would do him far more harm than good in the long run, and so Private Kururugi had carefully eschewed their company. His conservatism quickly paid off. Within the first 2 weeks of January, all of the men who had expressed verbal dissatisfaction or anger with Britannia after the Christmas incident had vanished, and fresh honorary recruits had been assigned to their squads. It sent a clear message to Suzaku that his current position was far too exposed to even consider networking yet. After all, if anybody remembered his frenzied anger from that fateful day and decided it hadn't been a moment of passion, he might be brought to the attention of the military police, dooming the plan before it got off the ground. So in the service of that plan, Suzaku carefully tucked his anger away and stored it in a private corner of his heart, and had immersed himself ever more deeply in the identity of Private Kururugi. The first step had been proving Private Kururugi the most diligent soldier in the battalion, a willing servant of Britannia and the ideal honorary Britannian. He worked long hours without complaint, and spent his off hours washing floors, scrubbing toilets, and polishing his boots to a mirror's sheen. It had taken time, but he had gradually struck up a rapport with his platoon's Britannian lieutenant, Chester Rockwell, the same lieutenant who had blanched at the screams of a man being slowly burnt alive. From careful observation, Suzaku knew that Lieutenant Rockwell still felt guilty about the incident and, though he tried to hide it, resented the battalion's commanding officer Major Humphrey for his order to remain in the outpost's walls. Private Kururugi had taken his time to cozy up to the young junior officer, carefully soothing his guilt and assuring him that the men under his command didn't resent Rockwell in the slightest. Rockwell had been eager to hear what Private Kururugi had to say, no matter how little resemblance it bore to any kind of truth. Just as Suzaku had expected, the lieutenant had greatly appreciated being handed a reason to no longer feel guilty. Lieutenant Rockwell had rapidly paid off that quiet favor. As new recruits filtered in to fill the holes left by the men who had departed at Christmas and those who had departed in the ensuing weeks, Kururugi was promoted to corporal. Officially, he had been recommended for the promotion due to his hard work, but Suzaku could read between the lines of the official notice. He was, after all, a politician's son. As a corporal, Kururugi had command over one of the 2 fire teams that made up his squad, and 4 privates reported directly to him. Suzaku was heavily tempted to start suborning the 4 men of his detail to his way of thinking, but restrained himself just like always. Instead, he drilled his men relentlessly, not only participating in the mandatory platoon and squad training sessions but more or less forcing his men to join him for supplemental training on their off hours. They resented him for it, but after he beat the only one stupid enough to openly defy him into the ground, they did as they were ordered. By the start of February, the daily regimen of training and voluntary extra chores had become rote and the complaints had ceased. Every waking moment not spent training or working, Suzaku had drilled his small command on the rules and regulations stipulated by His Imperial Majesty's military code, doing his best to hammer a deep respect for the legal underpinnings of the system into his underlings' heads. This schedule had continued day in and day out for just over 2 months, when the news from Niigata trickled down the grapevine. The Britannian battalion that shared the outpost with Corporal Kururugi's formation left first, dispatched on April 8 to Tokumachi in Niigata Prefecture. This development had been met with mild interest by the honorary Britannians of the 3rd Regiment, but little had changed other than the increased availability of hot water in the showers. 2 days later, the battalion had been woken up early and hurried onto buses bound for northern Toyama Prefecture. All Suzaku's sleep-befuddled brain could manage at the time was despair. Undoubtedly, This deployment meant that the Britannian troops had been unable to contain the uprising, and that the anarchy and bloodshed were spreading far and wide. He had silently railed against the impatience of his people. If they rose up now, didn't they realize that they would all be wiped out piecemeal, and that the Britannians would simply be even more on guard in Area 11? Any realistic change in the system required careful planning and coordination, not wild anger. Even if the people did rise up as one and force the Britannians out, did they truly think that the Chinese would let them enjoy their freedom? He had despaired of his people. How many would die in these pointless revolts was beyond him, but even one would have been too many. Now, weeks later, Corporal Kurugi did his best to harden his heart as he nibbled on a pickled squid. There was no point in despairing over choices come and gone, he told himself. All would ultimately be justified. Indeed, all that he had seen and done in Toyama had already been partially justified. While his continued diligence and zeal in the field had undoubtedly improved his reputation with the Britannian officers commanding the unit, Corporal Kurugi's first field deployment had taught him a very important lesson. The Britannians were deeply afraid of the 11s, both number and honorary Britannian. For a long time, Suzaku had privately suspected that the Britannian hatred and contempt for 11s was rooted equally in belief in Britannian superiority and in the fear of the oppressed common in all conquerors. The swaggering Britannian chauvinism was easy enough to see, but the fear was just as visible if you knew where to look. Why would the Britannians raise and train honorary Britannian units from former 11s, but refuse to arm them? Why would the prefect of Toyama panic and offer the balance of his treasury to ward off underfed and unarmed refugees? Why would a crowd of civilians led by Britannian soldiers and officers murder their nominal comrades? They're afraid of us. It was the only reasonable conclusion. It was also a bitterly ironic one, considering the dull placidity of Suzaku's fellow soldiers in the wake of the Christmas incident. Britannian fear had brought Corporal Kurugi's unit to Toyama. In an attempt to soothe that fear, truckload after truckload of luckless civilians had been taken from their villages for the flimsiest of reasons and sent to the filtration and concentration camps. Corporal Kurugi could understand the evil logic behind the plan. By concentrating all of the potential recruits in camps out of reach of the insurrectionists and by filtering out the individuals most likely to cause trouble, the prefect had constructed a human firebreak that would keep the insurrection out of his territory. It was sickening, but the idea made a sort of short-term sense. Privately, Suzaku wondered just how far into the future the prefect of Toyama was thinking. He had crushed the immediate threat by incarcerating who knew just how many of his own people. But Suzaku doubted that the human firebreak was anything but a stopgap measure. What was the prefect going to do? Keep all of his farmers and workers locked up? Impossible, his fields would go fallow. And what about the thousands of troublemakers? Suzaku was profoundly thankful that he hadn't been personally involved in the filtration process, but he knew men who had taken part, and their second-hand descriptions secretly sickened him. Someone would find those unfortunates sooner or later, all packed in layers in trenches 100 meters long. What would happen once word of those long scars in the earth leaked out? More Britannian fear. That was all Corporal Kurugi was certain of. More Britannian fear, which would prompt more Britannian crackdowns, which would continue the cycle. And the more scared the Britannians got, and the more desperate they became for reassurance and for answers. Corporal Kurugi smiled and got to his feet as he pushed Suzaku back into the box deep inside his mind, his fire team hastily cramming their last bites into their mouths before rising up around him. In 20 minutes, his platoon would be on a bus heading back to the Tokyo settlement. There would be opportunities galore in the sweltering capital of the area, especially since the fighting in Niigata showed no signs of slowing. The Britannian soldiers deployed to the troubled province would be far away from the Britannian concession, which meant there would be plenty of assignments available for a diligent soldier with a plan. It would all be justified. Victory would wash away all stains and justify all means, and Area 11 would be a prosperous and happy land. Kurugi Suzaku had a plan, and by pushing men, women, and children up onto those trucks with the full knowledge of where they were going, he had purchased an opportunity. Sooner or later, the trenches would be found, and the 11s would lash out like clockwork. The Britannians, guiltily aware that their chickens were coming home to roost, would once again be frightened and search for someone to help them. And when they looked for someone to clean up their mess, someone who could get the job done while remaining non-threatening to the powers that be, docile, obedient, and trustworthy, a model honorary Britannian. And once they let him through the doors of power, once they depended on him keeping things clean, then and only then will it be time to make my move. Lashing out with rage is pointless, only action based in cool logic will produce a truly ordered society. Lots of people would die before Suzaku got his chance. He owed it to all whose bones would form his road to the top, Britannian and 11, to not let it go to waste. It will be worth it in the end, Suzaku thought to himself, resolve settling in his gut like a lead weight. It has to be. April 19, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Britannian Concession, Tokyo Settlement. 1603, Lee Britannia has announced the capture of Damascus. After a brief, the television winked off at the click of a remote, the talking head in front of a backdrop of Cornelia astride her Gloucester disappearing into the void. Silence returned to the lavishly appointed conference room. Any whisper that slipped under the thick wooden doors softened into nothing against the deep plush of the antique carpet under the table. The room's lone occupant turned from the television with a sigh to face the neat stack of papers piled up in front of him. The densely packed language described committee minutes and budget proposals, scholarship applications, and admissions interviews, all carefully read, notarized, and signed without a single pen stroke out of place. All told a representation of 3 hours of work, all of it nominally voluntary. A small sacrifice in the name of a larger game. It would have gone faster with a bit of help, but, probably for the best, he mused. If Millie was here, she absolutely would have gotten distracted by hour 2 and started getting creative with the paperwork again. Lelouch Lamperouge, vice president of the Ashford Student Council, sighed good-naturedly, sliding the fruit of his labors into his briefcase and coming to his feet. He did not check whether his smile was sufficiently casual, cool, and disarming in the dim reflection in the darkened television screen. Lelouch Lamperouge was always cool, but endearingly casual with his friends, and had no reason to carefully manage his air of effortless ease. Indeed, at this point Lelouch Lamperouge was a comfortable role, one that he had worn so long that he no longer had to think about maintaining the facade. Only a handful of people across the planet had ever known him by a different name, and most of those had probably forgotten him entirely as anything but an obscure footnote. And even fewer people remember my sister. Which might be to her benefit, even if it is still galling. Besides, even if the role had been new or unfitting, Lelouch had worn masks of one sort or another for most of his young life. Haughty masks of imperious pride at social functions, armor against fawning courtiers. Stoic masks of resolve, when his mother had died and that man had spurned him. Smiling masks, when he had lied to Nunnally, telling her that they were living in a mansion surrounded by fields of flowers. Always and everywhere, endless masks, for his own safety and for the safety of those he loved. Of course, masks could only provide so much protection. His mother had never felt the need to wear a mask, but he doubted that any mask could have saved her from the assassin's bullet. Perhaps if she had been a bit better at dissembling, less skilled on the battlefield but better at the games of courtly intrigue, she would not have died. It was impossible to tell, but her son had learned a lesson that day, and another the day after. Disaster struck when you least expected it, and showing your true reaction in the face of calamity only compounded the damage. I am no Marianne the Flash, no ace amongst aces. What was I thinking? If I had just kept myself under control, I would still have been within striking distance of that man. Eyes shut, Lelouch forced the thought of what could have been away. It was far too late for second-guessing now, and in all probability, nothing would have come of them even if he still was within reach of that man. After a moment to re-establish his soft smile, the vice president opened the stained oak door and set forth to find the president, ready to be temporarily free of Millie Ashford's ebullient enthusiasm for at least a few days. Millie Ashford was lounging out in the academy's garden when he found her, draped artfully across a stone bench. The position, while admittedly intriguing, could in no way be comfortable, but he didn't think it was meant to be. While he hid behind a facade of smiling indifference, Millie relied on her beauty and sensuality to escape from the burdens of her own life. The Queen of Ashford played games using the academy as her board, a small slice of the world where she was in complete control, where she could pretend to be the mistress of her destiny. Lelouch did not begrudge her for her games. While it was irritating to be a pawn on another's chessboard, she was usually gentle with her toys. Besides, he owed the ever-smiling blonde a great deal. After all, unlike the rest of the student body, a certain middle schooler accepted, Millie knew Lelouch Lamperouge by another name. A name that, to the rest of the world, was 6 years dead and buried. Considering how living in Britannian society under a fresh identity would have been all but impossible without her family's support, putting up with a few idiotic school events and some extra paperwork were the very least he could do. And a new name and a roof over our head isn't even a tenth of what I owe the Ashfords for. He hadn't eaten in 2 days and he felt so weak, but Nunnally was depending on him, and if it hadn't been for the Ashfords, hadn't been for Sayoko. Lelouch stopped, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. That was years ago, he reminded himself. You're safe now. Nunnally's safe now. They found you in time. Everything is okay. Eager to escape the memories, Lelouch turned his thoughts back to his hostess of the last 4 years. Even beyond the debt he owed her, he had found in Millie something of a kindred spirit. After all, I doubt anybody in Area 11 wears as many masks as Millie Ashford. Apart from myself, of course. Of all of those many masks, the one that Millie was undoubtedly most fond of was the flirt. Her current performance, while likely not targeted towards him, was an example of the rarely subtle power wielded by the Queen of Ashford. Despite knowing the Ashford heiress's tendency to wield her sexual appeal as a bludgeon, Lelouch couldn't help but notice the way she angled her leg to accidentally reveal just 2 fingers' width of creamy thigh. Puberty was kind to her, Lelouch thought, seized with a sudden burst of sympathy for his friend and sometimes chauffeur, rivals Cardimund. The poor boy had been obviously besotted with Madame President for over 2.5 years now, and still hadn't mustered up the courage to confess. Probably for the best. She's only putting on her show because she doesn't want to be tied down to anybody yet. A light laugh told him that he had been caught staring, but he did not flinch. Lelouch's Lamperouge facade did not care what other people thought, letting all opinions roll off a gloss of utter self-confidence. Sometimes, it wasn't even a facade. With a total lack of shame that didn't have to be manufactured, he raised his eyes and met Millie's dancing blue eyes with a polite smile. "Careful there, Lulu," she teased, rising to her feet in an almost leonine manner, a predatory cat prowling towards enthralled prey. "Shirley's looking for you again, and she's pretty mad." Millie leaned in, and the man could smell her floral shampoo. "Someone might have told her that you've been gambling again. Wonder who that could be?" That matter was unimportant, as was the gambling, and indeed as was the need to evade Shirley. Lamperouge knew that Millie loved her little games, but was completely certain that she would protect the secrets of his that truly mattered. After all, harboring a fugitive of the crown, officially designated as such or not, was an act of treason, and thus punishable by wheeling. And if there's one thing that characterizes Millie Ashford, apart from shameless flirting, it's loyalty to her family. She'd never listen to a word her useless parents say if it wasn't for that loyalty. "Well, that's annoying," Lelouch smiled, pulling the sheaf of carefully taped paperwork from his briefcase, "especially since I just completed the safety forms for the Equestrian Club's upcoming polo meet. I was planning on going for a nice stroll in the concession now that my work is all finished, but if I have to find Shirley and soothe her concerns, I might not have time to properly submit it before I leave. After all, Madam President, I'd hate to stay indoors on a day like today." Millie narrowed her eyes dramatically, the smile morphing into an equally theatrical pout. "You drive a hard bargain, Lulu. But if you want me to go play with the pretty redhead to distract her as you sneak out the gate?" The pout was already wearing thin as the habitual smile shone through like the sun behind a cloud, and Millie abandoned the mask of disappointment in favor of a broad grin and a lecherous giggle. "I'm game. After all, that kind of work pays for itself, especially since you already checked over the snack bar's expenditure report. Right here." With a smile, Lelouch pulled a slim folder from his briefcase and handed both it and the forms over with a smirking flourish. "Now, I think that it's about time for my walk, Madam President. If you'll excuse me, I really must go." "A walk? Really, Lulu?" Millie sighed theatrically as she briefly thumbed through the folder, before sliding the nonsense into her backpack. "Honestly, that's pathetic. It's like you didn't even try to come up with a cover story." Looking up at the slightly taller Lelouch with a mocking expression of feigned curiosity, Millie let a finger lightly brush her lips, feigning an innocently questioning air that was only somewhat undermined by the mocking twinkle in her eyes. "Is it poker again? If so, you better win something for me." I'll accept various forms of tribute, including candids and candy. Completely aware that anything he told the inveterate gossip queen would inevitably make its way back to the perpetually blushing Shirley and his far too canny sister, Lelouch said nothing but waved a lazy goodbye as he made his way out of the garden. Manipulating Millie was refreshingly easy and straightforward. She knew what he was about, but so long as she was adequately paid in her chosen currencies, she was happy to be used. Besides, I'm probably just as happy to be used by her. If she wants to run interference with Shirley in exchange for a little paperwork, I'll oblige her. Half a block away from the academy, he slowly relaxed his hold on the school persona of Lelouch Lamperouge. He allowed himself to stoop forward slightly, shoulders rolled forwards into an almost defensive hunch as he carefully shortened his stride. Nothing like the cold haughtiness that was his sword and constant companion at Ashford. A small disguise, but as clothes made the man, affectations made the personality. I hope Shirley is enjoying the distraction Millie had in mind, he thought to himself as he made his way to the nearby maglev station. Even if she isn't, well, I'm sure Millie's having her fun at least, and Shirley's a good sport about that kind of thing. To her immense credit, Shirley Finette was tolerant of a great deal of discomfort and setbacks. She was dedicated in all she did, unfortunately including her single-minded pursuit of him. Shirley was the captain of the swim team as well as the secretary of the student council, both of which were time-consuming positions, but she managed to balance both with a fulfilling social life and an impressive academic career. As the vice president, Lelouch was privy to her grades and knew for a fact that she had not turned a grade under a 95 since the 4th grade. Unfortunately, that dedication to her pursuits was paired with a painfully naive personality and a complete inability to take a hint. Lelouch had been dodging the girl and her ridiculously obvious crush for well over a year now, and she had yet to get the message. If it wasn't so clear that she really cared about him and didn't just want the social cachet of catching him, Lelouch would have driven her off months ago. As it was, well, Lelouch continued to muse over the enthusiastic, if sometimes annoying, swimmer as he swiped his card over the automated turnstile, but soon grew bored. Ultimately, while she was pleasant company, she wasn't exactly useful. He doubted her naivety would pair well with the revelation that he was a fugitive from the state. But at the very least, to her credit, she isn't a bully. She's very kind to Nunnally. Thinking about the swimmer led Lelouch into considering the other members of his tiny ring of friends. Rivals Gardimund was a cheerful soul, always helpful when asked. Lelouch, who had never been particularly mechanically minded, was always vaguely impressed by the level of care the other boy showed when he maintained and serviced his motorcycle. Lelouch also found it admirable how little Rivals' family drama had dented his chipper personality. His parents' messy divorce was rarely brought up, but Rivals' desire to rebel against his parents wasn't lost on Lelouch. His obsessive chase after Millie was, Lelouch knew, part of that. He'd only mentioned it once, but Lelouch was under the impression that an arranged marriage was awaiting the Gardimund heir back on the Gold Coast. But until he goes back home, I've got a talented driver who works for free, Lelouch thought with a smile as he boarded the train. Well, not quite for free, but a small cut of my winnings and sympathy when Millie swats him down again, in exchange for an on-call chauffeur? Done and done. For all of their ups and downs, Lelouch would have liked to consider Rivals and Shirley to be his friends. But how can I call them my friends when they have no idea who I truly am? I have been lying to them since the day we met, which are shaky grounds indeed for sincere connections. No matter what, until they learned who he truly was, until they learned who he and his sister had been and what they had survived, there would always be a wall between him and them. Millie, on the other hand, at the very least knew that he had once been a prince. True, she didn't understand what that truly meant. Nobody raised outside the snake pit called the Imperial Court truly did, but she had a glimmer of understanding that the other two lacked. Besides, there was an element of cynical maturity to Millie that Shirley and Rivals lacked. Below the smirking, teasing, and at times infuriating veneer of confidence, Millie knew that she was an object with value and utility, the key word being object. Her family had been stripped of its noble status when the enemies of Marianne the Flash had descended like vultures upon her vulnerable allies, but a path back to that status for the House of Ashford led through her bedroom, a fact of which Millie was well aware. Of course, there was another path back to the nobility for the Ashfords, besides an advantageous match for Millie. Reuben Ashford had taken Lelouch and Nunallian after the conquest in the name of the loyalty the Ashfords still bore for Marianne vi Britannia. Unspoken was the understanding that favors must one day be repaid. His mother had, after all, been a commoner raised to the nobility as the concubine, then wife, then empress. It was obvious to Lelouch that Reuben hoped that, when he came into power, old friends would be remembered, and all that had once been the Ashfords and more would be restored. And if that's all that he wants, it would still be an excellent exchange. My life and Nunally's, plus years of support and protection, in exchange for some piddling titles and attractive land? An absolute steal. Of course, that begs the question of what Reuben might do if I don't try for the throne. Aristocrats, fallen or not, never forget to collect on a debt. Rocking with the motion of the maglev, Lelouch gazed idly off through the window, still lost in his thoughts. While he had friends and compatriots, a grand total of 3 of them, they were only marginally useful for his long-term goal of revenge, and he was deep in the hole to the Ashfords. Unfortunately, apart from the comparatively plump balance accumulated through his illicit gambling and Sayoko, whose wages he had only just started paying himself over the last year, those 3 friends represented the entirety of his power base. It was a dismal arrangement, to say the least. Ashford was only ever a starting point and a place to rest. It's past time I start finding useful people outside its walls. Among the many shortages in Area 11 engineered by the current governor, useful idiots were in bountiful supply. Before Christmas, tensions had been rising as fools in power pillaged the compliant idiots below them, while rebellious blockheads raised pygmy rebellions. After Christmas, the whole province practically throbbed with inflamed passions. Idiocy dripped from the mouths of nobles. Nobody wants to do an honest day's work. Stupidity foamed from the working class. The honorary Britannians are taking our jobs. And milquetoast indecision burbled from the middle class. Somebody really must take the nobles in hand. And that was before considering the running sore that was the official state church, who leached from parishioners in exchange for increasingly derivative sermons. While the Britannic Church had always been a cheerleader for the imperial court, any pretensions to the contrary had disappeared in Area 11, where the bishop had made himself a symbol by gorging to the point of resembling a bipedal swine draped in yards of cloth of gold. To a man with an ounce of sense and almost £500,000 spread across a number of accounts in different names, the possibilities in Clovis La Britannia's Area 11 were boundless. Just looking out the window proved as much. The walled Shinjuku ghetto was visible in the distance, but surrounding those walls were endless blocks of urban sprawl, underdeveloped and aging. A few minutes later, the devastated area south of the revitalized glitzy heart of the Ginza district swam into view, a monument to Britannia's uneven development and the lack of attention invested in Area 11. And that's not even getting into the districts where the truly unwanted of the empire live, under the elevated concession itself. No trains ran anywhere near the perpetually dark arcologies that clustered fungus-like under the broad shining pavilions of the Britannian concession. Harkening back to New Bristol, built at the mouth of the Mississippi River back in Area 2, the concession had been built on massive stilts to gaze imperiously down at the Tokyo settlement radiating out around it in the still rotting corpse of the murdered megacity of the same name. Whole districts of which, prime urban real estate all, had been left to rot as the vice-regal governor fooled around with his Clovis Land amusement park and other vanity projects. Though they were too small to see at the moment from the elevated maglev track, all of those streets were full of Britannians and numbers just looking for someone, anyone, to give them a reason to hope for a better tomorrow. I really should send Clovis a thank you card for preparing such fertile grounds. Wouldn't he be surprised? Lelouch almost laughed at the absurd thought. Nobody ever thanks poor stupid Clovis for his idiotic gifts, but this time I might actually have sincere cause to appreciate him. Not that he'll ever know, of course. Not until it's too late. Alan Spicer dismounted from the maglev at the Ginza station. Ducking into a restroom, Spicer quickly changed out of the Ashford Academy uniform and into nondescript business casual. Spicer decided that he was a low-level functionary for the administration as he carefully sorted out his tie in the restroom mirror, loosening it once it was tied and undoing the top button of his cheap white button-up. After all, I'm off the clock now, aren't I? A few blocks south from the maglev station, closer to the urban abscess around the Tokyo Tower and away from the bustling streets of the most fashionable shopping district in the area, Alan Spicer found an unsuspecting target, a lower middle and upper working class neighborhood, Local mom and pops nestled amongst chain convenience stores at street level and apartments on the floors above. The perfect place to take the pulse of the people. Despite a half hour remaining in the typical workday, the sidewalks were densely populated. Knots of men sat on benches and the curbs outside of convenience stores, smoking cigarettes and passing brown paper bags from hand to hand. A few of the stores were dark, and 2 had boarded-up windows. This, Alan could tell, was a neighborhood fallen on hard times, a neighborhood where wages weren't keeping up with inflation and jobs were scarce. Alan found a small deli, purchased a sandwich with a handful of coins and bills the proprietor instantly snatched off the counter, and had an early dinner at the establishment's grimy counter. As he munched on his ham on rye, Alan carefully listened to the grumbling old man at the counter and the other elderly men slouched over a cribbage board behind him. He listened to the chatter of the other diners coming in and to the anxious titters of the housewives coming by for a quart of potato salad. Around his seat in the deli, life in the little slice of Britannia abroad continued on apace. The papers said last month a new infrastructure package was allotted, but that damned culvert's still leaking, one of the cribbage players groused as he moved a peg forwards, and the supervisor's office still hasn't fixed the pothole over on 10th. It's the damn train, his partner grunted, ever since His Highness fell in love with it, that's where all the money goes. After all, who needs roads when we call all ride the fucking train? Yeah? Sorry Mrs. Fisk, the proprietor was saying, but I gotta make a profit somehow. You know, a pound just doesn't buy what it used to. But this is the second time in a month. The client, presumably Mrs. Fisk, ground out, before sighing. I'm sorry George, I know we all gotta make a living somehow but a pound just doesn't buy what it used to. George finished, nodding sympathetically. Tell me about it. The transportation costs alone are really killing me. Pity the prince can't divert some of the saccharidite here, instead of shipping it all back to the homeland. Seems like a bit of a waste. It wouldn't be so bad if some people weren't benefiting from it. This time, the bitterness in Mrs. Fisk's tone was undisguised. My Lloyd's been working the same job for 4 years now, and hasn't had a raise in 3. He's a good worker, but that bastard Saucy froze all raises, and now nobody's hiring. Times are tough for everybody, George said with a weary sigh, an apprehensive note entering his voice as he peered around the deli's eating area. But, I mean, we just gotta keep on going. Prince Clovis. He knows what he's doing, right? He'll help us out, things just have to get a bit more stable and all first. From your mouth to God's ear, George, Mrs. Fisk sighed. From your mouth to God's ear. I mean. Her eyes darted around the tiny eatery. I'm not one to gossip, but those temporary taxes. This is the 3rd year they've been renewed. That can't be what His Highness meant to do, right? It just can't. It ain't right, George muttered from behind his counter, his rough grumble somehow sliding under the ambient noises of the business and into Lelouch's ears. It ain't right that they squeeze us so. What do the knobs think we are, numbers? Alan Spicer kept his head down as the conversation tapered off. By the time he had finished his sandwich, Mrs. Fisk had long since left with her purchases, as had a handful of other customers with similar complaints. After leaving the deli, Spicer wandered through a pharmacy, a convenience store, and a cheap chain coffee shop. The story was seemingly the same everywhere, with only minor variations on a consistent theme. Nobody was happy, it seemed, and nobody was prospering. Most people thought that something should be done and indeed, would be done, if only Prince Clovis knew how bad things really were. The consensus was that blame should be placed on the corrupt nobles and crooked advisors taking advantage of Prince Clovis's good nature to put unreasonable demands on his people. Everything Alan heard only confirmed his impressions of the area's mismanagement and decline. The commoners were unhappy, and authority had proven unresponsive at best. Corruption was the order of the day, and nobody had the political will or desire necessary to change that. In the end, it all seemed to boil down to money, as Alan supposed it always did. The wages weren't going up, yet prices skyrocketed. Taxes were paid, yet potholes remained. Policemen and government functionaries on the take had grown greedy, and the administrative fees that were once a part of doing business had grown unmanageable. The clerics of the Britannic Church grew ever more insistent in their demands for voluntary charity in the name of nebulous good works that never manifested. To hear the common Britannian inhabitant of Area 11 tell it, The entire weight of the empire had fallen on their shoulders and they were groaning under the load. A pound bought less each month, and somehow the area exchequer found a new special tax to impose on an equally monthly basis. And none of them are willing to blame Clovis for it. Alan shook his head, wishing that came as more of a surprise. It's all that man's fault. After the emblem of blood, people just wanted stability, and that was something he could provide. Stability, and a renewed pride in Britannia on the heels of fresh conquest. The commoners don't want to return to the chaos, and so they won't question that man's issue, even when he's the clear root of all their ills. For all that the common Britannian citizens refuse to put the blame for their increasingly awful lives at the feet of the man responsible, those unheard and unaddressed complaints were still entirely valid. Alan knew exactly the kind of desperation that could take root as people watched their loved ones suffer, better than most Britannians, in his opinion. At a certain point, the unthinkable became necessary, and once that threshold was crossed, Alan shook off the cobwebs of memory and continued to slouch around the neighborhood, listening as the hungry and the ignored proposed their favored scapegoats. Obviously, the nobles are behind it all, a grizzled man sitting outside a shuttered bookstore claimed. They're getting fatter every fucking day. It's the damned honoraries. An off-duty soldier growled, spitting her chew into the dry soil of an empty planter. Give 'em an inch, and they think they're real Britannians. It makes me sick, Sharina barracks with 'em. They're fucking animals, filthy too. Nobles or honoraries or even the browbeaten 11s, almost everybody that Alan eavesdropped on in the neighborhood had at least one grievance in common: broken promises. When the Empire had needed settlers to populate its newly won area in the wake of the conquest, families of good Britannian stock had been recruited from Pendragon, New Bristol, Charleston, and half a dozen other metropolises with extravagant promises. To Alan, it sounded as if the recruiters had promised that every family that moved to the newly christened Area 11 would become de facto barons, ruling over a subservient 11 population. And yet, 6 years on, the pick of those servile 11s had become their legal equals and now competed for the same low-skill jobs that many of the commoner Britannians had been imported to work. The remainder of the 11s had not been parceled out as chattel to the average Britannian. The majority now worked as serfs on noble estates in the country, or got to sit around in ghettos where state funds, our taxes, had to be expended to keep them in their place. The anger on this street was powerful, but not directed. Or rather, it's directed at too many targets. These everyday tradesmen and workers would happily attack anybody they were directed at, if they thought it would improve their situation. The nobles, the 11s, the honoraries. Perhaps the administration, even. Anybody except that man, the one who duped them into coming to Area 11 to begin with. The first step would have to be focusing that anger on the desired target. That much was obvious. The how of the matter was the trickier question by far. As Alan continued to wander around the neighborhood, 3 broad approaches coalesced in his mind. The most obvious course of action is to give a speech, lending the people a voice to channel their anger in a proper direction. I'm sure the theater club could render me unrecognizable, but if any of them see a recording of the speech. Alternatively, instead of bothering with a disguise, I could find a local collaborator willing to act as a mouthpiece. Finally, I could use other media in place of public speaking, further reducing my exposure. All 3 options had their upsides. To the man behind Alan Spicer, the first approach held the most personal appeal. Holding a crowd spellbound, hanging on his every word. The concept spoke to him. I suppose it's in my blood, he thought with a snort, in a manner of speaking. Yet, that most appealing option was also the most risky of the 3 by far. At best, success meant kicking off a local riot, while failure to engage the public or to escape in the aftermath might lead to imprisonment. And once I'm behind bars as a political provocateur, there's very little Reuben could do for me. I doubt my cover would hold for long. As it is, the risk is far too high for any potential gains. Finding a useful idiot to serve as a cipher was the next best option. It had the same advantages as a personal speech, an immediate emotional connection with the crowd, mass appeal, and no logistical requirements except a soapbox, with the additional advantage that the audience would probably accept the message more easily if it came from a familiar face. Plus, an additional degree of separation from the effects of the speech, good or ill, could only benefit Alan Spicer. Unfortunately, Finding someone both charismatic enough to give a good speech and sufficiently foolhardy to mouth off about the authorities would take time, especially if the recruit had to come from the local population to be truly effective. Identifying and recruiting such an individual would take time and effort, and would in all likelihood require Alan's presence in the target area for a substantial amount of time, which would make it hard to preserve an identity that was currently as shallow as the clothes he wore. Besides, recruiting a local mouthpiece still represented a potential threat to his cover identity as Lelouch Lamperouge. Someone who fit his target profile might be intelligent enough to wonder about his mysterious new friend, and might try to follow him back to Ashford. On the other side of the problem, if anybody noticed how often he came to a random working neighborhood, and especially if anybody who knew him as Lelouch saw him dressed up as Alan, he ran the very real risk of arrest long before he had any chance to strike a blow against Britannia. Ultimately, public speeches by their very nature drew attention to the speaker, and the best shield the man had at his disposal was anonymity. While Lelouch was all but certain that his fight against that man would one day strip his identity of Lamperouge away, just as it had his first identity, the longer he could hold on to his current name the better. If attention-grabbing speeches were off the table, he would have to use less obvious means. During his tenure as the Student Council Vice President, he had spent quite a few long hours in the Ashford Academy print shop. Mostly, those hours had been spent in preparing materials for some silly event or another. With Millie Ashford at the council's helm, there was never any shortage of spontaneous events that just had to be advertised with custom signs, banners, and posters. As a result, he had a solid working familiarity with the poster production process and the necessary credentials to access the room and use the machines while the academy slept. While Lelouch would never call himself an artist, he also had some familiarity with image editing software. It shouldn't be too difficult to draft a poster or two that would inflame the common rabble against their ineffectual and foolish masters. The initial brush fires might be slow and small, but through propaganda I shall ignite all of Britannia. The only potential rough spot would be distribution. He would have to transport the posters from the academy to the neighborhood and paste them to every available surface all by himself. Recruiting help would be too risky. Which means I'll have to put up something like 200 posters all by myself. Alan groaned aloud as he started to make his way back to the maglev station. The prospect of so much manual labor was daunting, but he didn't see any other viable alternative. I wish there was someone I could trust to help me with this. Well, there's Nunnally, but she's out for obvious reasons, and Millie. I don't know if she'd approve. I wonder if Suzaku's. No, he told himself with a firm shake, don't even think about it. Best not to ask. Even if he isn't. With a mental shove, Lelouch pushed thoughts of old friends and the identity of Alan Spicer away as he boarded his train. He'd have a few sleepless nights in his future, but very soon he'd be taking his first step towards revenge against that man and all he held dear. 3 days later, the man who was sometimes Alan Spicer slouched in a chair outside a small coffee shop, tiredly blowing on his steaming cup, eager for the caffeine. It had been a long night, and he had a council meeting in 2 hours, all but guaranteeing a long day ahead. But the sleepless night had been far from a waste. The entire street practically drowned in a sea of purples, oranges, and blacks, posters firmly attached to practically every vertical space available at street height. Doors, windows, walls and utility poles, all sported the luridly colored posters he had run off in the Ashford Academy print shop the last evening, severely denting the supply of colored ink. In truth, it had been Lelouch's second nocturnal trip to the print shop. After Alan had returned from his fact-finding trip, Lelouch had thrown together a poster design and run off 200 copies. He had intended to go out and post them all the following night, but Shirley had successfully monopolized his evening, delaying his schedule. This had proven to be something of a blessing, because the next day's issue of the Oriental Messenger, the biggest paper in Area 11, had broken the story of the new Clove Island North under construction in the Sendai settlement. Between the fawning lines proclaiming anticipation for the new rides and praising the vice-regal governor for his desire to provide all children with a place to play, Lelouch had spotted a few tantalizing details. For one, the project had apparently been made possible with the help of a special voluntary tithe collected by the Diocese of Area 11. Generally, such voluntary tithes were collected on behalf of the starving on the grounds that the Britannic Church had some vague requirement to keep all Britannians capable of aiding the Emperor in his holy work. Another easily overlooked fact contained in the puff piece was that much of the remainder of the money for the amusement park's development had been appropriated from the area's development fund. That particular fund underwrote contracts for public improvements and the maintenance of civic infrastructure, including roads. Taken together, those two juicy tidbits had been too good to pass up, leading to a new hastily thrown together poster design and a second trip to the print shop. In the end, he had managed to accomplish his task in a single sleepless night. Dressed in workman's overalls swiped from a public laundry, Alan Spicer had wheeled a dolly laden with cans of paint-on adhesive, brushes, and the multiple boxes full of posters down the street from Ashford Academy to the Maglev station, and from there onto the otherwise empty train that ran through the night. Soon enough, he had pushed his cart through the streets of the small neighborhood that was his target, quietly sleeping on a Thursday night in preparation of the workday soon to come. By 5 the next morning, when the first early risers had staggered from their apartment blocks, they had been greeted by a sea of brightly colored posters. Now dressed in his office drone costume with entirely authentic bags hanging under his eyes, Lelouch had buried the cart and overalls in a dumpster and slouched into the queue of a local coffee shop. A pot of cheap drain cleaner in hand, he'd found a seat in the outdoor area, eager to see the reaction to his first foray into mass media. And now, I can enjoy the fruits of my labor. The man calling himself Alan smiled as he took a sip of his cheap coffee, wincing at the burnt flavor of improperly roasted beans. I wonder how they'll all react to the knowledge that all the money set aside for fixing their roads and plumbing has gone to building another toy for my idiot brother, and that his elephantine bishop has guaranteed that there will be no special handouts come May Day? Across the street from the cafe, a small knot of passers-by had begun to congregate around a shuttered bookshop. Alan smiled to himself as the sounds of muttering drifted through the early morning air, taking another sip to hide his anticipation. The broad, empty windows had given him plenty of real estate for his posters, and even across the street he could clearly read the bold print of the posters. Clovis the clown laughs as he robs you. The font of the first line, splashed across the top of the poster, could have come straight from any number of familiar circus announcements. The bottom line, stamped across the poster's foot, was in an uncompromising stencil. It's past time for the circus to go. Between the two lines of text, a clown with Clovis's unmistakable pretty face reclined in a throne of stacked pound notes, his motley the purple, blue and red of the imperial arms. The bells of his coxcomb cap had been replaced with the large silver coins of the archaic pound sterling, more of those same bullion coins rolled from his jacket's folds and pockets. Of course, despite the hoard he sat atop and the coins pouring out of his pockets, the vice-regal clown, as his large name tag helpfully identified him, held out a begging hand to the viewer, demanding ever more with an imperious smirk. The clown was not alone. Behind his throne, a large table stretched. On the right side, the table creaked under the weight of abundant food, most of which was rapidly disappearing into the maw of a remarkably porcine man with a bishop's mitre, while to the left a hungry-looking man in workman's overalls glared impotently at his empty plate. Quite a masterpiece, if I do say so myself. Alan congratulated himself. Especially considering how high of an opinion Clovis has of himself. Why, if he saw one of those posters for himself, he might collapse from apoplexy and vastly improve the area's government. Although, considering his awful taste in clothes, he might actually find it flattering. The internal congratulations felt a bit hollow as the intended audience failed to react as expected. There were one or two laughs, but most of the group just shook their collective heads and walked away. Nobody seemed energized, nobody seemed engaged, and the only ones who seemed at all interested were the remaining cluster outside the bookstore, who seemed to be muttering angrily about something. Alan strained to hear what they were saying. This could be it. Perhaps they realized the point. Maybe they're reading the finer print connecting the new amusement park to the funds set aside for infrastructure. Maybe. You think we should wait for the cops to show up, or should we start tearing them down already? Wait, what? There's plenty of the bastard things everywhere. The coppers'll have plenty to choose from. Let's just start getting rid of them. The sooner they're gone, the better. No need to bring any more heat down on our heads than the bastard who put these up already bought us. The last speaker immediately put word to deed, hooking his fingers around a loose edge of the nearest poster and ripping it down, only the top right quarter remaining in place as the rest tore cleanly away. You idiots. No. You're wrong. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. Don't you realize that they're taking advantage of you? Why? Why won't you see? To the man who was both Lelouch and Alan Spicer, it was all but impossible to hold his peace as the local Philistine set to work destroying his hard work. Soon, the air was full of the sounds of tearing paper and jeering laughter, and the gutters were full of shredded and defaced posters. A teen in school uniform soon set to work gathering up the decimated posters and cramming the detritus in a garbage sack. To the man's growing horror and anger, the group's self-appointed task started taking on a bit of a holiday air, as two young men raced to tear down the most posters, to the laughter of bystanders. I don't understand it. Why the hell aren't they angry with Clovis? Don't they understand how he's just using them for money? Don't they care? The man raged impotently in the prison of his mind, helpless to do anything but sip from his bitter cup. Idiots. They're all idiots. I'm surrounded by fools. Pardon me, young man. Alan jolted back into the present as an old man tapped on his shoulder before gesturing at the other chair at the outdoor table. But is that seat taken? Alan just shook his head, not willing to trust himself to speak at the moment. I can't believe it. Hours of work, all for nothing and vanishing in minutes. Well, at least I didn't opt for the speech. What a disaster. As he stewed, the pensioner hobbled around the table before gingerly lowering himself down onto the iron seat of the chair with a sigh of relief. Ah, that's good. Take my advice, Sonny, don't live long enough to get old. You won't be missing a damned thing. Despite having never met any of his grandparents, the old fogey seemed almost stereotypically grandfatherly to Alan, complete with the desperate need to inflict conversation on the youth. Thanks for the advice, sir. Alan's tongue felt leaden in his mouth, but it didn't seem like the old geezer would be content with silence. I'll be sure to keep it in mind. You do that, you do that. The man took a long sip from his own steaming cup, seemingly heedless of the heat. Ah, that hits the spot. Say what you will about the 11s, but they grow some damn fine tea. Do they? Alan replied automatically, still trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. I'm more of a coffee man myself. Well, hopefully you live long enough to reconsider. Tea takes more time to get right, but it's a more civilized beverage. The old man took another long sip. You're not from around here, are you, Sonny? No, sir. Abruptly, Alan realized what he'd just admitted in his distraction. I mean, I only moved to this district fairly recently. Still trying to get used to the place, that's all. Oh? The man took another sip, before setting his cup down on the table and closing his eyes. Alan turned back to his own cup, hoping that he'd recovered quickly enough to evade any suspicion. Another sip and I'll claim I need to go to work and leave. No need to look even more suspicious by leaving my coffee behind after flubbing a question. Suddenly, the retiree's eyes popped open as he leaned in closer to Alan, gnarled fingers tight around the head of his cane. You won't get any takers for your rabble-rousing here, Sonny, the man's harsh voice rasped out, quiet enough that only he and Alan could hear but lacking any hint of the earlier softness. I suggest ye haul your mangy carcass out of this neighborhood toot sweet. The cops have been called, and if you're still here in 5 minutes I wouldn't be surprised if you end up with a few broken bones resisting arrest. Suddenly, the grandfatherly mien returned to the pensioner as he took another long sip from his cup, draining the last of the tea. I see that I'm not the only one wearing a mask here. Alan scowled, slamming back the rest of his coffee before getting to his feet. The old bastard was staring straight at him, a smile equal parts benevolent and mocking below eyes cool and unsympathetic. Damn it. It's hard to tell if this old fool was telling the truth about the police, but if he was. With a curse, the man who wouldn't be Alan Spicer as soon as he got out of sight from two observant elder and the rest of the ungrateful cretins on the street jumped down from his table and shouldered his way through the rapidly swelling morning crowd, briskly walking away from what was an undeniable failure. Thankfully, nobody followed him, at least not that he could tell. As soon as he turned a corner, he broke into a run, pelting down the road away from potential pursuit, and jinking onto a side road as his limited stamina wore out. Almost immediately, he ducked into an alley and let himself collapse against the cool brick of the wall, completely winded. Damn it. I really need to put more hours in on the treadmill. Shirley must never know. The man breathed in, and breathed out as he hastily pulled away the cheap clothes he'd worn under the coveralls the night before. The brimmed cap he'd worn to cover his hair went first, before he pulled the cheap white button-up off, revealing a novelty print shirt, freshly purchased a day earlier from a souvenir shop in Clove Island itself. As the man wadded up the dress shirt, and threw it after the hat into the dumpster, he took another deep breath. Lelouch slowly exhaled, letting the air flow out of him. The urge to lash out was almost irresistible, but Britannia's rejected son mastered himself. As cathartic as a temper tantrum would be, he needed to keep moving. If the old man had told the truth and the police really had been summoned, Lelouch couldn't afford to stick around. I can't take care of Nunnally if I'm being held for inciting a riot, after all. Nunnally. Shit, she's going to be so pissed. Shaking his head angrily, the exiled prince left the alley, straightening his shirt and tightening his belt as he walked briskly away from the evidence he had left in the dumpster. He'd made a mistake somewhere. But, all of that could wait. He had to get back to the gated sanctuary of the Ashford grounds. Once he was safely ensconced in the clubhouse apartment, he could flagellate himself in private. It was easy to blend into the thickening crowd near the maglev station, with nobody paying attention to a surly teenager trudging through the gates and out onto the platform. Families enjoying weekend sojourns, couples out for day trips in the settlement, and honorary Britannians hawking snacks swirled around him as he slouched down onto an available bench. Dotted throughout the crowd, 11 janitors pushed brooms, polished railings, and generally did their best to keep their heads down and avoid notice. Probably a wise move on their part. Within minutes, a train glided out of the station, a near-silent symbol of the prosperous tomorrow promised by the continued development of the area. The state-of-the-art carriages were sparsely populated, the route away from the trendy downtown districts was unpopular at this time of day, and Lelouch had little difficulty finding a seat away from the irritating, ungrateful masses. Finally, all but alone, he let himself start to think about the morning's events, and where he had gone wrong. In his short life, Lelouch had only gotten drunk a handful of times, usually at the instigation of Millie Ashford. He liked being in control, both of himself and of those around him, and alcohol made it all but impossible to remain in command of his faculties. Besides, with the thin physique he'd inherited from his mother, the hangovers were simply too miserable to justify whatever joys could be offered by the preceding bacchanalia. Now, aboard one of the most prominent symbols of his half-brother by blood only's reign, Lelouch felt like he was finally sobering up after a prolonged bender. Who needs alcohol to get drunk when royal arrogance is available, after all? It was a bitter thought, especially after all he'd gone through since he'd left the imperial court. What the hell was I thinking? I wasn't, clearly, damn it. Forget Nunnally, if Sir Yoko finds out, I'm dead. His original plan had unquestionably been arrogant. A few hours' worth of eavesdropping had given him just enough of an understanding of the common crowd's problems to get their attention, but he hadn't understood how complacent they were. That complacency was itself something of a mystery. Based on the anger he'd overheard, Lelouch had thought the whole neighborhood was teetering on the edge of a riot before he'd even arrived, which was why he'd tried to give a speech to catalyze existing anger. It could be that the denizens of that particular neighborhood were simply comfortable enough to fear losing what they had more than they resented the loss of what could have been. Perhaps he had been overly cynical, and the people truly did believe it when they expressed their faith in Clovis's leadership. Lackluster governance and rampant embezzlement be damned. Or maybe they're scared? Lelouch clenched his eyes and cast his mind back to a blessedly short time when he hadn't known where he'd find his next meal, or more importantly, Nunnally's. Scared of tomorrow, scared that it would somehow be worse than today, scared of putting a foot wrong and losing everything. And always scared that someone was watching, waiting to pounce. I wonder if they were laughing at the posters, or laughing out of the fear that someone watching would think they agreed with what the posters said? Either way, it was obvious to the disinherited Vi Britannia that he had, simply put, jumped the gun. A handful of posters wouldn't stir housewives and skilled workers to public expressions of discontent, much less rioting and rebellion. The poster design had been lacking too, laughable instead of inspiring or terrifying. Worst of all, by just showing up the same morning potential inflammatory posters appeared everywhere. Lelouch had looked incredibly suspicious. In academic terms, he had tried to show up for a test without having so much as opened a textbook in preparation. No wonder all but a handful ignored the posters. No wonder the few that didn't just laughed. And no wonder that old bastard noticed me. I couldn't have been more obvious if I'd tried. Presumably the only reason he didn't hand me directly over to the police is because he thought I was so obvious that I was an agent provocateur sent by the government to test the neighborhood's loyalty. With a derisive snort, Lelouch rose to his feet as the maglev coasted into his station. It was amusing, in a sort of backhanded fashion. After all, Lelouch doubted that any organization led by Clovis La Britannia was competent enough to arrange an actual agent provocateur, at least not intentionally. The Christmas incident had, in his opinion, undoubtedly been deliberately provoked, probably by the purists themselves. Well, look at the bright side, my idiocy might have reduced the locals' opinion of the area's spooks and their competency today. What a wonderful achievement. Absolutely worth missing a night of sleep. A pair of students waved to Lelouch from the platform as he exited the train, and he effortlessly slid back into character as Lelouch Lamperouge. A slight wave, a smirking smile, and a vague greeting were adequate to bring the two freshmen to the point of swooning, and the man who played the role of the student council vice president slipped away and out onto the streets of the upmarket neighborhood surrounding the academy. Thankfully, Ashford's campus nearly emptied on the weekends, and the man was untroubled by the handful of students who lived in the on-campus dormitories as he crossed the verdant grounds to the student council clubhouse. The day was fresh and bright, at odds with his mood, and he felt relief as the door to the clubhouse foyer clicked shut behind him, leaving him alone in the cheerful and tastefully appointed room. Above his head was the apartment he shared with his beloved little sister and Sayoko, but the man opted not to immediately activate the keycard-protected elevator and return home. Nunnally, his precious little sister, his only full-blooded sibling in a sea of half-brothers and half-sisters, was likely sitting at the dining room table in her wheelchair at this time of day, perhaps already finished with her usual light lunch. She would be smiling, the adorable quirk of her lips drawing attention away from her perpetually closed eyes. Nunnally. 7 years ago, his old life as Lelouch Vi Britannia had come to a shattering end over the course of a night and a day. His mother, Marianne Vi Britannia, had breathed her last in a pool of her own blood before Lelouch's horrified eyes. Her last act had been one of heroism, as could only be expected of Marianne the Flash. She had shielded her younger child with her own body, even as the still unknown assassins had riddled her with bullets. Said assassins had fled into the night, entirely unhindered by the mysteriously missing guard detail. Their mother's sacrifice had saved Nunnally's life, though not her mobility. A stray bullet had sheared across the small of her back, devastating the last 3 vertebrae of her lumbar spine and condemning her to the life of a paraplegic. Overwhelmed by the horror and trauma, Nunnally's eyes, the same imperial purple as his own, had closed forever, blind despite remaining fully functional. She had survived, but her life would never be her own, especially not in Britannia. The very next day, a young Prince Lelouch had sought out an audience with his father, and at the age of 9 had demanded justice before the assembled court in the imperial palace at Pendragon for his murdered mother and crippled sister. He had demanded an investigation into his mother's death, demanded that his father care. And when that man, never his father, hadn't, Lelouch had said the unthinkable, and declared the man who had ended the emblem of blood unworthy of his throne. With the benefit of hindsight, Lelouch could see that he had been premature in doing so. Just like he had this very morning, Lelouch had jumped the gun. Within that very day, he and Nunnally had been on a plane bound for Japan, officially going overseas to the semi-hostile nation to study abroad, a polite fiction to maintain the dignity of the imperial family. They had been exiles in truth, as well as de facto hostages. A prince and a princess were valuable pawns, even if the one was disinherited and the other crippled. It had been in Japan that the true nightmare had begun. And now, 7 years later, I'm making the same mistakes again. Lelouch lowered himself to a thickly cushioned bench and let his head tilt back and thump against the wall. I acted without thinking when I demanded that last audience back then, and Nunnally and I both paid for that mistake. And now, everything that he had done since coming to Japan had been for Nunnally. That man had been an ocean away, far out of reach, and vengeance had lost its urgency as the situation in Japan deteriorated. Britannia had come and reduced Japan to Area 11 in a month of horror that touched every life on the archipelago. They should have died then, would have died to the righteously vengeful Japanese if Suzaku hadn't given them warning and helped them get away. For days, Lelouch had walked through the broken land with Nunnally on his back, inventing fabulous details and describing dream palaces in a bid to distract his beautiful little sister from the heaps of corpses surrounding them, already putrefying in the hot sun of late summer. In some ways, Lelouch felt like he had never left that death field. Sometimes, on nights when he couldn't sleep, he still felt Nunnally's horribly slight weight upon his back and the stink filling his nose and mouth. He and Suzaku had given her everything they could find that was edible and most of the water, but she'd already been so light when they had left Kururugi Shrine together. He cringed when he remembered how his first thought had been relief that he wouldn't have to ask for Suzaku's help carrying her. It had been a child's thought, ignorant of the implications. 2 days later, he had sent Suzaku away, back to his father. Lelouch hadn't wanted to drag his first friend with him into the grave, not after his people. His empire had taken so much from the other boy. It had been a noble impulse, but it had left him with nobody to help him care for Nunnally. She couldn't care for herself, not without her legs or eyes, and he'd been forced to search the bodies and homes of the dead for her meals, rarely finding enough to feed himself as well. Eventually, he had been forced to leave her behind as he scavenged, pickings growing slimmer as other survivors scrounged through the ruins. Every time he had left, Lelouch had been scared, so scared that she wouldn't be there when he came back. That angry Japanese survivors or cruel Britannian soldiers would have found her and kidnapped her or killed her. The only thing he had dreaded more was coming back and finding her frail body still where he had left her, but her beautiful heart forever stilled as her strained constitution had failed her. He had been so scared. It's okay, he told himself as his chest grew tight. It's okay. She's okay. You're okay. Sayoko helped us. We're all okay. She's still alive. Lelouch had grown accustomed to that weight upon his back, the burden and blessing that was living his life for his sister. He had grown comfortable bearing that responsibility. Indeed, he had grown too comfortable. Familiarity breeds contempt. When did you start holding Nunnally in contempt? They were his thoughts, but he could almost hear that man's voice. Callingly, he couldn't refute the words immediately. After all, why else would he have gone off on some harebrained plan to inspire popular resistance? Why else would he have grown hungry once more for revenge against that man, other than he had decided on some level that he was tired of caring for Nunnally? If he had been arrested, who would have held Nunnally's hand as she fell asleep this evening? How long would it have taken for the goons of the Directorate of Imperial Security to find this apartment and tear his sister from the small measure of comfort she had found? But I can't hide behind Millie's skirts forever. Staying hidden at the academy was never supposed to be a long-term plan. How long until that man finds her here? I have to do something. But what can I do without endangering her? Lelouch's brooding was suddenly interrupted by the buzzing of his cell phone. Desperate for a distraction from his circling thoughts, and guiltily eager to find a reason to avoid the apartment for just a bit longer, he immediately opened the device to check for his message. Hey, rivals? What the hell does he want? Hey yeah buddy, the message began, hope your weekend's going great and all. Did you get that assignment for world history done yet? Oh, and are you doing anything next Friday? Lelouch gritted his teeth in irritation with his friend, occasional confidant, and sometimes chauffeur. Mask on, Lelouch. Just think of it as a reason to not think about fucking up and almost endangering Nunnally again. Uck. I've had better weekends, honestly. And yes, I finished the Cromwell paper on Tuesday. And yes, you can copy it. Just before he sent the hasty text back in reply, curiosity compelled Lelouch to add another line. What's happening on Friday? A moment later, his phone buzzed again. Thanks buddy, knew I could count on ya. Remember that group I've been volunteering with? Well, the lady running it said I should bring a friend next time. She's a hottie too, so it's not a big deal for you, right? Oh, and guess what, you know Callan, right? The Stadtfeld girl from third period. She's helping out there too. Just in case you needed another reason to go besides hanging out with your best buddy. LOL, Callan. Stadtfeld. The dots finally connected for Lelouch. Wait, wasn't that who Rivals said had taken him to the city back in December? The girl from the newspaper club? The one who tried to sneak into my apartment? A chill shot down the once prince's spine. Involvement in either instance might have been pure happenstance, but taken together? First, she tried snooping around my home, and now she's trying to suborn an associate of mine. Is that her game? How long until the IDSS's goons come? What if they were here all along? You drive a hard bargain, rivals. The phone was in his hand almost before he knew it. Sure, I'd love to come and meet this cutie charity worker. And Stadtfeld will be there too? Score. I'll clear my plans for Friday night. If she really is up to something, I need to know. There's too many factors at Ashford, so I need to see her when she's alone. Besides, there's no way anybody my brother employs would be happy to serve soup to homeless honoraries. If she's actually happy doing it, then I might just be paranoid. Lelouch allowed himself a snort of bitter amusement. Either way, I won't let my inattention bring danger to Nunnally. I've been complacent, but not anymore. If this Stadtfeld girl is an agent of my brother's, I need to know. Springing to his feet full of renewed purpose, Lelouch pounded his passcode into the panel guarding the stairway up to the second level before taking the stairs two at a time, suddenly eager to see his darling sister once again. He had screwed up today, but he'd learned his lesson. He'd destroy anybody who threatened his sister, but he would take his time in doing so to guarantee that she wasn't endangered by his actions. Building a new world where Nunnally could live safely would take time and effort. Rome hadn't been built in a day, and Britannia wouldn't be destroyed in a weekend. Lelouch still thought that his original plan to turn Britannian society against itself was a good one, but he couldn't do it as a single isolated man. Doing so would all but guarantee Nunnally's arrest. He would need catspaws and ciphers, disposable minions and useful idiots. He needed an identity with greater depth than a fake mustache and a shirt from a second-hand store. Next time, he'd do a better job preparing for his task. His sister would be safe. His sister would always be safe. And the only way his sister could ever be truly safe would be if that man, their father, was 6 feet below the earth, along with every single person who would dare raise a finger to her. As Sayoko greeted him with a bow and a murmur of welcome home, Master Lelouch, the once and former prince, smiled with relief. The plan would work. It had to work. The whole world could burn, but it would be worth it. It has to be. April 20, 2016 ATB, Viceroy's Palace of Area 11, Britannian Concession, Tokyo Settlement. 2217. The conference room stank. After the meeting of the Viceregal Council and all of the various invited movers and shakers had stretched into the third hour, the cigars had come out, partially explaining the stench. Barely masked by the stench of tobacco, a rich bouquet of anger, panic, and desperation permeated the atmosphere. It was entirely at odds with the overstuffed chairs, mahogany table, and the rococo gilding that crept like fungus over every exposed surface. Despite the generous size of the room, it felt strangely claustrophobic to the agent, even from his position by the broad windows, far from the scrum around the hulking conference table. Every department of the area administration had sent at least one representative, many of whom had arrived with a horde of flunkies. Not to be outdone, all military units over regimental size had sent an officer or two as well. The units affiliated with the purist faction, despite being few in number, had sent enough nobly born representatives to match the rest of the military contingent man for man. Every major industrial or commercial concern in the area had someone to speak for them as well. And that was before the viceregal governor's retinue was added to the fray. Aristocrats and artists, bodyguards and courtesans, all had tried to talk their way into the conference room claiming to be key decision makers. Fortunately, most of the parasites had been contained to the hallway outside the conference room itself, but more than enough had insinuated themselves into the council room to confuse the situation still further. Taken together, the agent was confident that nothing of consequence would be decided tonight, at least not in regards to the stated topic of discussion for the meeting. While it was plausible that some undertakings benefited from committee leadership, the man in the unassuming grey suit doubted that counter-guerrillan operations were amongst that very select set. He was fairly convinced that winkling partisans out of the countryside required a measure of consistency in approach as well as clear and informed leadership. Unfortunately, somebody on the governor's staff had seen fit to convince the prince that all hands were required for such a worrying issue, hence the summons to anybody of the right sort who felt they had a stake in the matter. And of course, everybody's scared of guerrillas, so everybody came. What a shocking development. Next to the agent, one of his comrades from the directorate shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, probably working the kinks out of some cramping muscle. He could sympathize. They had been standing in their little corner of the conference room for almost 5 hours now, waiting for their nominal leader to call them forth to present what information and analysis their office had scraped together over the last few days. Making matters worse, Margrave Jeremiah Gottvald and a colonel that the agent didn't immediately recognize were locked in a shouting match just a few yards away. And I'm telling you that just hitting them harder isn't working. The nameless colonel snarled, his nose almost touching the Margraves. The ones actually responsible for the attacks are long gone by the time our boys show up, and as soon as we leave they come back and keep killing police officers and mining roads. We can kill all the 11s in the area and they don't give a shit. That's simply a result of your boys' utter incompetency. The Margrave sneered down at the slightly shorter man. If they moved at a pace worth of their oaths of service to His Majesty, perhaps they might arrive soon enough to actually do some damage. Besides, sooner or later the rebels will run out of peasants to hide and feed them, and it's not like there's any shortage of the ungrateful little peasants to replace them. A single elegant eyebrow quirked upwards. What, are you squeamish about killing a few handfuls of peasants? I took you for a fool, Colonel Beasley, not a rebel sympathizer. Beasley blanched momentarily, before his face reddened to an alarmingly beefy hue. How dare you question my loyalty, Gottvald? If we weren't both on duty, I'd demand a duel this very instant. As it is, I don't give a good goddamn about a bunch of numbers squatting in rice paddies, but I was ordered to leave enough alive to sow the fields and bring in the harvest. Depopulating the countrysides of 3 provinces in response to a few thousand rebels would be an absurd waste of resources. Not to mention that the rebels would still be out there, setting fires and blowing up roads. Yes, things will get worse before they get better. Gottvald snorted, waving his hand contemptuously. A missed harvest is a paltry price to crush a rebellion before it spirals completely out of hand. As long as any number so much as thinks about raising a hand to his betters, I say Proclamation 9 should be up to 1,000 per head. The Margrave smirked slightly. Perhaps that might get a lesson through their thick skulls. And what happens when we run out of peasants, Gottvald? Beasley ground out, civility barely present as his face darkened still further to puce. Are you going to set your purists to work harvesting the rice and rebuilding the area's economy? Don't make me laugh, your men are barely even soldiers, much less competent workers. If we kill every 11 in sight, then how exactly do you expect anything to get done? The entire damned place will grind to a halt. I think that Lord Jeremiah might have a point. The agent resisted the urge to groan as His Highness Clovis La Britannia, 3rd Prince of the Holy Britannian Empire and Vice-Regal Governor of Area 11, meandered over from his place by the conference table to join the conversation between Colonel Beasley and Margrave Jeremiah, a small army of followers trailing after him. This damned meeting's getting longer by the minute, I can feel it. He exchanged small commiserating glances with his fellow spooks. The meeting hadn't been a complete waste of time. The loose-lipped potentates had let slip a vast array of gossip as well as plenty of scraps of useful information. As soon as he returned to his office, he'd transcribe all of the mental notes, before finally indulging in a shot or 3 of the cheap whiskey he'd hidden in a desk drawer. But until then, focus on his royal pain in the arse. After all, the prince was saying, any good gardener knows that weeds must be pulled promptly, lest they overrun the garden. If our good 11s hear about how much difficulty a handful of farmers with pre-conquest military surplus are causing us, who knows what might happen in the cities and settlements. Best the thistle were plucked before it spread throughout the rose bed. So nothing we haven't been doing for the past 6 years. Excellent. At a gesture from the prince, a secretary scuttled over to the conversation with an obsequious yes. Your Highness? Memo, Clovis snapped, nodding to the Margrave. Let it be known that until the end of the current emergency, and though it pains my merciful heart, the penalties demanded by Proclamation 9 shall be increased tenfold. Make sure that's on the front page of the Oriental tomorrow. As the clerk scuttled out of the conference room, the Viceroy made his way back towards the conference table, thankfully followed by the 2 officers, who had resumed glowering at one another as soon as the prince had turned his back. There's some real animosity there, far beyond the professional. Something to keep in mind for the future. Near the head of the mahogany table, the rotund Deputy Minister of Justice was finally moving on from the inevitable brown-nosing to something worthwhile. Investigations revealed that Lord Griswold and Lord Kelso had each attempted to bribe members of the judiciary, Lord Kelso on no fewer than 4 individual occasions. Curiously enough, all in regards to matters related to real property with disputed ownership. Ah yes, trying to forcibly purchase the parcels owned by honorary Britannians via the courts. Naturally, the deputy minister swelled up indignantly. All of our honorable judges turned down such crass offers. The agent resisted the temptation to snort in derision. However, as members of the public happened to overhear these exchanges on at least 3 occasions and reported them via official channels, we are of course beholden to bring these attempted purveyors of corruption to your highness's attention. Someone overheard and complained, and now the deputy minister is trying to head off an external investigation at the pass. Since all of our judges are corrupt, he must be worried about something else. Very interesting. Indeed, the deputy minister blathered on. In light of current mutterings about matters of official corruption, I would like to open formal and public proceedings against both men. I understand that this is a course rarely taken, especially against gentry of such fine breeding, but a display of your highness's even-handedness despite social status could endear you to the common rabble. One or both of the lords in question must have something on the deputy himself, and now the worm's seeing a chance to get out from under their thumb. That's definitely worth opening an investigation of our own. The agent appended that tidbit to his file of mental notes for the night, and imagined himself underlining it for good measure. If we can figure out what hook they've got him wriggling on, we can use it for ourselves. While the agent had focused on the deputy minister, the prince had found a chair to artfully drape himself across. On one hand, it is a sad necessity for any gardener to distinguish plants that shall flower into beautiful blossoms from drab duds, but a look of acute discomfort flashed across the prince's face, there for an instant then gone without a trace, leaving the usual easy smile behind. I am not entirely sure that targeting these 2 fine gentlemen is in the best interest of the area. After all, what if they appeal to their family back in Pendragon? Who knows what turbulence they may bring to our beautiful Area 11. Coward. The agent frowned minutely, before smoothing his expression back into calm neutrality. The nobles will never be called to account, not while the prince is terrified of their families back in the homeland. Royal or not, crossing the old houses is a risk, especially when the royal in question is as weak as Clovis is. On the other hand, if the third prince wasn't a known craven, I doubt the emperor and the chancellor would have put him in charge of Area 11, with all of its Sakuradite reserves. They needed a man of sufficient rank who would be too frightened of the homeland to make a play. And they found Clovis. Your Highness, I implore you to reconsider. The deputy minister had begun to visibly perspire despite the air-conditioned coolness of the room, but to his credit his voice was still steady. In light of the current situation, it is of vital importance that the people know of your even-handedness and your devotion to just and good governance. If the citizens of your fair area see you dealing with those who attempt to undercut the execution of justice, they will certainly have confidence in your ability to deal with the rebels. Despite himself, the agent was impressed. Bold of the deputy to push back against the governor like that. And he actually managed a coherent argument too, well targeted Clovis's vanity. But he subtly peered at the blonde prince from the corner of his eye, noting the vaguely anxious expression barely hidden by that rose the royal was incessantly sniffing, but I don't think it was quite enough. Apparently, the deputy minister of justice agreed with the agent's impression. Your Highness, the rebels present a potential threat to the Sakuradite extraction operations so integral to both Area 11 and our Holy Empire. Undermining the justice system puts the central pillars of our society at risk, ultimately endangering the Fuji mines. The deputy minister paused, took in Clovis's clearly unimpressed expression, and went for broke. Ultimately, Your Highness, you are the prince here, set here by Your Majesty the Emperor to not only reign but rule. Your mercy has already been sorely abused by these dishonorable numbers. Why must you, our beloved vice-regal governor, also endure the abuse and shame of being robbed by these thieves? No matter how blue their blood is, your blood is that of Britannia. For the first time in hours, silence, blessed silence, filled the conference room for a few seconds, before a wave of susurrating whispers emerged from the packed ranks of courtiers, bureaucrats, and officers, calling out Lords Griswold and Kelso as thieves stealing from the prince himself. He's either definitively won, or his career and probably life are over. The agent felt the corners of his mouth twitch up ever so slightly. Thieves calling out thieves. What a day! Steadily, the prince drew himself upright in his chair before rising to his feet, rose elegantly held between two white-gloved fingers and pointing out across the table towards the huddled knot of clerks and secretaries recording the minutes.
We've heard quite enough.
Secretary, by the will of the third Prince of Britannia, Clovis La Britannia, issue orders for the arrest of Lords Griswold and Kelso. Just as the secretary had finished scribbling out a note and was handing it to a waiting messenger, the prince coughed and spoke up, relaxing from his dramatic position to a more natural posture. Also, send word to my speechwriter. We need to get something ready to announce their arrest. Tell him to work the line exorcise the foul canker of untrustworthy servants in there somewhere. When the governor was born a prince, the stage missed a great talent. With obvious relief, the deputy minister returned to his chair, slumping down and wiping his brow even as his own clique of hangers-on clustered around him. To the agent's great relief, the Minister for Internal Affairs was the first to stand and make his way to the place by the head of the table, immediately to the prince's right. After a few moments of pleasantries, the minister jerked his head towards the small knot of intelligence men. Finally, I can give my report. Your Highness, the agent bowed low, calibrating the exact angle of his groveling just as carefully as he calculated the bland tone of his voice. Too dull and he'll go to sleep, too emotional and I'll sound like a thespian. I regret to inform you that we have detected rumors regarding far more serious topics than a handful of corrupt nobles circulating through the population. The agent carefully rose, and moved to stand directly to the left and a half pace behind his boss, a carefully choreographed play they'd worked out in advance to underline the importance of his words. After all, that's the best place to stand when knifing a man. I am afraid to report that the so-called Christmas incident remains quite divisive in common society, across all economic classes and throughout the rank and file of most units in the area. While most of your adoring subjects fully support the obvious truth that the incident was caused by honorary Britannians murdering Britannian soldiers, and the bulk of the damage was the natural result of drunken and out-of-control soldiers taking their revenge, a significant portion of the population questions or outright denies that version of events. The picture of the soldier from the 32nd Honorary Legion in particular is stirring up discontent. Halfway down the table, Margrave Jeremiah let out an audible snort. And? The commoners are always muttering about something. If it wasn't a few dead 11s, it would be something else. Besides, the Margrave shrugged dramatically, lip curled up in a sneer. Why does it matter if a few honorary soldiers died anyway? They shouldn't have been wearing those uniforms to begin with. Their blood could have only helped wash out the stains of dishonor they left on those poor garments. A mix of sycophantic laughter and a worrying amount of muttered agreement rumbled through the conference room. The agent was unmoved. Oh, don't worry, Jeremiah. We all know who Q answers to, and I've got 4 witness statements confirming that Q gave the marching orders on Christmas Eve. And I only had to fabricate one of them. Your day will come. I would like to remind the Margrave Jeremiah that my job is simply to report the facts as they have been collected by the local office, and to pass them on to His Highness without commentary. Unless. The agent turned fully to face the head of the purist faction in Area 11. Do you have doubts about the abilities of the Imperial Directorate of State Security, Lord Jeremiah? The teal-headed soldier growled out something that the agent couldn't catch across the length of the table, but waved his hand in a gesture that could just barely be interpreted as conciliatory. The agent nodded, before turning back to the prince. Who didn't make a move during that whole interruption? Who Jeremiah didn't even look at during his interruption? Does the prince know how weak that makes him look? Would he do anything if he did? Beyond mere rumor, the economic disruption caused by the events of last December is now being exacerbated by the current troubles in Niigata and Nagano prefectures. The damage to both the road network and the rail system by insurgent bombings, as well as the destruction of harvesting machinery, storehouses, and sake distilleries, have collectively slowed the economic growth of the area. The agent continued dutifully. This has impacted many citizens' livelihoods in a negative manner. Together with the ongoing unemployment issues, many settlements are starting to develop a large population of semi-permanently unemployed young people, who are rapidly becoming disaffected. Bah! The prince finally reacted, throwing himself back down into his chair and taking a prolonged sniff of the rose's petals. We already have plans for handling that little issue. We have been advised that Britannian unemployment is caused in large part by the employment of honorary Britannians. So, we are considering banning all Britannian-owned businesses in the area from employing any honorary Britannians.
that handles the unemployment problem. The agent carefully kept his mask neutral as the governor smiled, obviously pleased with cutting his very own Gordian knot. And to handle the economic discomfort issue, well, my people must know of how I, Clovis La Bretonne, love them. My love shall be expressed to every household through a one-time gift of £500. The rose swished through the air, and the secretary it alighted upon nodded, hastily scribbling on her pad of stationery. The prince was still talking, the rose losing a petal as it twirled between his fingers like a baton. Money is all well and good, but the people will need time to spend it to truly appreciate my love. A new public holiday will serve them well. Again, the increasingly bedraggled rose pinned a clerk to the spot. Let it be known that May 4th shall henceforth be celebrated in Area 11 as Vi Britannia Day, in honor of my dear lost siblings. Clovis threw a hand to his brow and mimed an expression of grief. Oh, how I miss them so. Now we shall all have a day preserved in their sweet memory. From his peripheral vision, the agent noticed how Margrave Gottwald jerked at the mention of the deceased royals. Oh yes, I know about that too, Jeremiah. I'm sure that your fellow purists know you were a former imperial guard, but do they know that you failed to protect the emperor's favorite wife? I doubt it. Brilliant, Your Highness, simply brilliant. That insightful analysis had come, regrettably, from the Minister for Economic Development. Also known as the fattest man in Tokyo, Bishop Lazaro Pulst was also the head cleric of the Britannic Church in Area 11 and the vice-regal governor's spiritual advisor. And possibly the single greatest beneficiary of the prince's administration. Your mercy and charity are truly awe-inspiring, my prince. I am sure that the people will be moved by your grief for your innocent younger brother, taken so cruelly from this world at a tender age. The agent, for his part, was considerably less sanguine. The whole point of the Honorary Britannian program is to integrate the choice portion of the number population, economically and culturally. If you take away their jobs and mandate that nobody hire them, that will send a clear message and destroy whatever progress was made in the last 6 years that the purists haven't already demolished. The agent fumed internally, even while he maintained his neutral expression. Plus, do you think all of those businesses will like having to pay the legal minimum wage? And just dumping money isn't going to solve the problems presented by the bombed-out roads and the torched fields. Before he could resume his report, Margrave Jeremiah felt it necessary to express his support for Clovis's plan as well. Good choice, Your Highness. Those jumped-up 11s were taking money out of honest Britannians' hands. I bet they were giving their paychecks right over to their brothers up in the mountains too, so cutting that money off means less bullets and bombs for the damned holdouts. Of course, the purists want the honorary program cut off entirely, not only in the army. This must be Christmas for Jeremiah. The agent grimaced internally at his choice of holidays. No, not enough flaming corpses for Christmas. Thankfully, the Minister for Internal Affairs cut in. If I may, Your Highness, I believe that my man was not yet finished with his report. The governor waved indulgently and the agent bowed again. Thank you, Your Highness. Now, it has come to the attention of the IDSS that the divide between the members of the army affiliated with the Purist faction and those unaffiliated has deepened precipitously over the last several months. We are concerned that this divide has crossed the threshold from a friendly rivalry into true animosity, and may degrade operational efficiency if left unaddressed. We are also concerned that a divide in our ranks might weaken the coherency of our garrison forces in Area 11, weakening us in the face of potential hostile action from the Chinese Federation. The rest of the army should be apologizing to us. Lord Kuel Sorsai, eldest son of a long and distinguished line, apparently couldn't hold his anger in check any longer. Pathetic. Even Jeremiah's got better self-control than this clown. Some damned thug of a Marine murdered a purist with a whiskey bottle and numbers serving in other units knifed 3 more in the streets. They owe us a damned apology. Perhaps after we get one we'll let them off the hook. Almost before Kuel stopped speaking, virtually every non-purist officer in the room stepped forward to angrily rebut the young noble's outburst, leaping to the defense of the service. Interestingly, the agent noted that General Bartley Aspirus, the commander of the 4th Brigade, 2nd Division of the Special Weapons Corps and a known personal friend of the 3rd Prince, held his tongue. Almost alone in the sea of uniforms pressing forwards to the table, the general hung back in his corner, accompanied only by 2 lab-coated men.
If every other officer here feels the need to express their loyalty to the army, why doesn't Aspirus feel likewise? Perhaps he doesn't feel the same loyalty as his fellow staff officers? After 10 minutes of squabbling, the vice-regal governor finally put an end to it. Friends, please, calm down. Fear not, we take no offense at Lord Kule's outburst. He is young, and full of eagerness to serve, and he after all comes from one of the finest families in Britannia. The collected soldiers slunk back to their chairs with a variety of glowering expressions, leaving the scion of the Saucy family practically beaming with smugness. To his credit, Jeremiah looked almost as irate as the rest of the soldiers. Ah yes, Gottvelt actually served in the regiments before he was elevated to the Imperial Guard. Most of the purists move straight into glorified parade units once they graduate from their cadet programs. And I am sure that we don't need to worry about the Chinese, of all people. The prince indulged in a long, deep sniff at the rose, before idly tossing it over his shoulder. After all, we're Britannians, by God. The Chinese are too incompetent to attack across water, the Europeans are too far away, and the 11s are weak and stupid. Besides, for a brief moment, an element of firmness touched Clovis's admittedly handsome features. We are all Britannians, and we expect all to pull together in the end, friendly rivals or not. All hail Britannia. Every courtier and staffer shot to their feet with a deep-throated bellow of all hail Britannia. As the echoes died out, the agent took the opportunity to finish his report. And to conclude, Your Highness, there is one last point that has troubled the IDSS. Namely, numerous fringe religious and political movements have begun to make themselves known across the area. We have found traces of subversive groups in commoner residential projects, numerous barracks, and even in a few neighborhoods housing the petty nobility. The prince leaned back in his chair, propping his head on his hand. Oh, how awful. The words were flat and the agent, feet away from Clovis, could see that his eyes were dull. He's gotten bored of this meeting. Wonderful. Well, I'm duty-bound to deliver this report, not to make sure that the governor cares about it. There seem to be a variety of groups operating in Area 11, Your Highness. Pamphlets from the True Anglican Church have been found in the vestries and lobbies of several military chapels. A large number of charitable groups have been established in recent months with names like the Friends of the 11th Society and the Honor Society of Honorary Britannians. There's even been a handful of lunatics arrested while publicly spouting off about the Prince Lelouch truth, a conspiracy theory, mostly because they were calling out for the true prince to come and overthrow your benevolent reign. Another storm of whispers filled the conference room as Clovis suddenly jerked in his chair, eyes wide awake and flaring. Similarly, Jeremiah let out what sounded like a grunt of pain, hastily concealed behind a cough. The agent smiled internally. He's awake now. Now, was it just the mention of your deceased brother's name that startled you, Your Highness? Or was it the prospect that your brother might not be quite as dead as previously assumed? Your Highness, the agent finally concluded, speaking over the rising tide of side conversations and halfway muted exclamations. Your lordships, gentlemen, the IDSS does not believe this sudden swelling of social and political organization is as spontaneous as it might seem. While it is possible that one or more operatives of the wings of Talleyrand may be active in the Tokyo settlement, we believe it is far more likely that we are seeing the early stages of leveler activity. And with that, chaos well and truly filled the conference room. The Minister for Internal Affairs turned and gestured, giving the agent and his compatriots permission to leave. With a bow towards the prince, who was already far too distracted in a hushed conversation with General Aspirus of all people to notice, the agent slowly walked out of the conference room, doing his best to not look too delighted to leave. The heavy oaken doors thudded close behind the trio, instantly muffling the uproar inside the jammed room. The agent nodded, and his two juniors set off down the left hall, which would eventually lead to a side door and the freedom of the end of shift. The agent took the right hall, but took his time descending into the sub-basement that appeared on no publicly available map of the seat of the area administration. The tiny IDSS enclave, and particularly the area set aside for the counterintelligence unit, was his home away from home, but the agent was uncharacteristically unenthusiastic to return. He already found himself missing the smoke-filled confines of the garish room behind him. Unpleasant or not, he would have very much appreciated the opportunity to hear the responses of the great and the good to the tail end of his report. After all, as a high-ranking leveler himself, who had spent years working his way up the ranks of the IDSS, he understood exactly how valuable having a man on the inside of a conversation full of loose-lipped fools could be. April 21, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 2004. Regrettably, Naoto won't be joining us for this meeting. Ogi folded his hands on the table before him and blandly smiled at Diethard as he spoke in Japanese. That man needs his sleep more than he needs yet another meeting. True enough. I nodded from the end of the small table, equidistant between Ogi and the reporter, replying in the same language. I didn't think that Callan strictly needed to be in attendance for this meeting either, so I sent her back home. No need to take unnecessary risks with her other identity, after all. I turned to Diethard. Anyway, despite the lack of Kozukis in attendance, consider this your introduction to the Kozuki organization. Charmed, I'm sure, Diethard replied, smiling sardonically at Ogi, who for his part, just gazed back with the bland passivity I distinctly remembered from endless meetings back in my first life. Ogi, meet Mr. Diethard Reed. I began the introductions, a journalist and producer with High TV. Mr. Reed, meet Kaname Ogi. Together with Naoto and I, Ogi is in charge of the Kozuki organization as well as the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. Oh? Diethard blinked languidly, before visibly giving Ogi a once-over, eyes tracing over my fellow officer's admittedly greasy pompadour, long sideburns, and battered jacket, and deliberately turning away from the only pure Japanese leader in the organization to look at me. Are you sure I can't meet with Nathan? Usually, stories with a more charismatic cast sell better. I noticed the slight stiffness in Ogi's shoulders, and internally commended him for refusing to rise to Diethard's obvious bait. No need to give the Brit any reason to fall back on the Savage 11 stereotype, after all. Still, Diethard is my problem, so it's my responsibility to see that he stays in line. Mr. Reed, I opened conversationally, if you attempt any social engineering to adversely affect the organization, its leaders, or its members, especially in such an overt manner, I will take it as a betrayal of the spirit of our agreement. I let the comment hang in the air for a moment and stared at the infuriating man, trying to convey exactly how unimpressed I was with his antics before giving up and opting to convey my feelings as unambiguously as possible. Just so there aren't any misunderstandings here, Diethard, let me be blunt. I spoke in slow, carefully enunciated tones while I maintained direct eye contact with the madman. You will treat Ogi with the same level of respect as you do me or Naoto. This is Shinjuku, and the heart of the rising sun. You are here at my discretion. Do not abuse it. I paused and gave the words a moment to sink in. Do I make myself clear? The man's infuriating smirk dimmed, and the deranged newsman gave me a nod that was almost respectful. Crystal. The itching in my fists died down, but I could still see the spark of madness twinkling in his eyes. It truly is Shugal all over again, I grumbled to myself. I'll have to make sure he's kept on a tight leash. An insane genius like that is as useful as they are dangerous. So, Mr. Kaname, Reed continued, turning back to Ogi, what is your role in this organization of yours? I handle internal management. Ogi replied, speaking slowly as he groped for the words. While my fellow officer had familiarity with Britannian, dating back to his childhood friendship with Naoto, he wasn't exactly comfortable with the language. Worse still, he once confided to me that stressful situations made it harder for him to articulate his thoughts in the Emperor's tongue. I had wanted to help him refresh his familiarity, since knowledge of the enemy's language is frequently useful, but there was just never enough time when we were both free. If you have problem or argument, or if you want to join, I handle that. I also help with training program. Fascinating. Diethard's dry reply, again skirting the very edges of rudeness, was blatantly insincere. Well, as Miss Tanya already mentioned, I am a journalist and a producer, which means that I specialize in finding engaging stories, and presenting them to the general public. He paused, and smirked. Let me know if I'm going too fast for you. I suppressed a sigh. I really am going to need to figure out how to deal with this Brit shit stirrer. I understand, Ogi replied, stoically ignoring the bait. Keep going. Well, to put it simply, I can really help your organization out in two ways. Presumably finished with petty one-upmanship for the moment, Diethard finally got to the point of the meeting. First, narrative management and dissemination. I can help shape your organization's story, and I can make sure that it gets into the public consciousness. Second, I am a fantastic investigative reporter. Between my own skills and my multitude of contacts, I can provide all kinds of useful intelligence to your organization. I already gave Tanya a free sample. A free sample? I broke in sharply. Mr. Reed, you assured me that everything you possessed was on that drive. Do we need to go back to the alley to help shake loose whatever you were hoarding? I have not lied to you, not once, Diethard replied calmly. After all, it is very important to establish trust between a subject and an interviewer. That drive contains the sum of my investigative work to date, but if there's one thing I have learned in my trade, it's that there is always another secret. I am sure there's plenty more dirt for me to dig up. All right. Oddly enough, I did believe him. In a strange way, Diethard wasn't unlike Shukel, the lunatic scientist and engineer who had haunted the final years of my past life. Just like Shukel, Diethard was a fanatic, and like Shukel, a slave to his obsession. In large part, that was why I'd assured Callan that I understood Diethard. I had dealt with his ilk before. Propaganda and intelligence, both quite handy for an organization like ours. That they are. Diethard practically oozed smug satisfaction. Honestly, you're quite lucky I decided to follow Lady Stadtfeld to you. The rest of the Fourth Estate here in Area 11, Japan, have no idea how to spin a story. They're also used to appealing to an audience of one that they've forgotten how to appeal to anybody else. Fourth Estate? Ogi asked, turning to me for clarification. What's that? The press, the media, journalists. All of that, I explained in Japanese. Anybody who isn't directly employed by the government and makes a career out of peddling information to the public. Ah, I see. Thank you. Ogi turned back to Diethard. Question: if news are all talking to Prince Clovis, what good is narrative management? And, what about censors? I sat back, curious to see how Diethard would respond to those points. I didn't mean that all of the news stations and papers are solely addressing Clovis, Diethard said with a smile that was only slightly patronizing. They make sure that he hears what he wants to hear and say what he wants them to say. The thing is, a good producer knows that any story can be told a multitude of different ways. If we're discreet and clever, the censors will wave any story we tell through with only minimal pro forma changes. You're quite sure of yourself, Mr. Reed? I studied the newsman, attempting to determine how much of his confidence was warranted and how much was bluster. Please give me an example of a story that you think could be aired that would advance the goals of our organization. The goals of the organization? Diethard lifted an immaculately shaped eyebrow. You haven't actually explained what your long-term goals are to me. Considering the soup campaign and the Hearts and Minds campaign you're running, I assume that this is more than a paltry gang, but beyond that I'm in the dark. I paused, rewinding our negotiations in the alley, the brief conversation we had on the way to the apartment building and the course of the meeting thus far. Damn, he's right, I completely forgot to explain what the point of all this is. I rubbed my nose, suddenly aware of how long today had been and how tired I was. In my defense, it wasn't like his recruitment followed the standard pattern. My apologies, Mr. Reed. Realizing that I was still holding the bridge of my nose, I folded my hands in front of me, aiming for a slightly more professional look. That particular oversight was an error on my part. You have joined a group dedicated to the liberation of Japan from the Holy Britannian Empire, and the re-establishment of the Republic of Japan as a free and sovereign entity. To my surprise, Diethard threw back his head, laughing, and finished with a round of enthusiastic claps. I blinked and looked at Hoagie, who shrugged at me, equally confused. Excellent, excellent. Diethard all but crowed, eyes wide and shining. I knew you'd have a story worth telling. Lady Stadtfeld was merely an appetizer, a starter. This is the story. My story. You're free to tell it once we succeed, I replied sharply, trying to throw some figurative cold water on the excited reporter. In the meantime, you still haven't answered my question. Yes, Diethard waved off my concern. Don't worry, I know exactly where to start. Think about it, who has Clovis been cozying up to for the last 6 months or so? The purists? Ogi ventured, before turning and speaking to me in Japanese. That's what they're called, right? The purist faction? They're the same ones who took the credit for the station and who you targeted for Kyoto?
Yes, I replied in Britannian for the benefit of both parties. Viceroy Clovis has been providing political support and clearly preferential treatment to the purist faction. This has given the purists license to aggressively pursue their own policies, such as the fratricidal attacks on honorary Britannian units last winter. Exactly. That must have been an excellent Christmas present for you, your enemy fighting their native allies in the streets of the area capital itself. Diathed's smile ripened with manic enthusiasm and unhinged glee. And since the prince can't admit that he screwed up by backing the purists, he made their narrative his own, doubling down on his error again. It was an unexpected outcome, I carefully replied. One that exposed a surprisingly sharp division in the enemy's ranks. And there you have it. Diathed smacked the table, emphasizing his point. That's the story you tell. Clovis is chained to the purists, who are dedicated to forcing all honorary Britannians out of the military. If you want to run stories against the Britannian military, smear the honorary Britannian units. The censors will hear honorary Britannian and wave you through, and suddenly you have anti-military content on every news channel in Area 11. Every channel? I mulled the idea over. Because once one channel runs a story and gets a positive reception, the others will follow suit. Diathed nodded as I followed his idea to its conclusion. And once every channel's running it, well, then it must be true in the minds of the consumers, yes? See, you're getting it. Diathed reached into his pocket, causing Ogi to tense, but only pulled out a small notebook. After a moment of fumbling, he started jotting down notes as he continued to speak. Once you've got that sort of consensus on your side, you can run almost anything, as long as you localize it to the specific issue. Rampant inflation? Well, it could be the prince's new vanity project, or it could be the honorary Britannians. Nobody's going to check. That's just basic scapegoating, though. Hardly anything revolutionary. Even as I pointed out the lack of sophistication, I realized what a foolish objection it was. Propaganda didn't need to be revolutionary, it just needed to work. Besides, we have other priorities at present besides the honorary Britannians. I paused, and then threw Diathed a bone. Thank you for the example, though. That did indeed answer my question. I turned over the example in my mind as I quickly caught Ogi back up with the conversation. He'd started to look slightly lost as Diathed's speech had enthusiastically accelerated. I was still leery about openly targeting the honorary Britannian population. Not only were the collaborators the only ones who had been educated over the last half-decade, they were also a natural way to get saboteurs, or at least assets, into the Britannian war machine. Besides, targeting the honorary Britannians would put the Kozuki organization at odds with the 6 houses in their role as the Numbers Advisory Committee, the foremost honorary Britannian authority in Area 11. I think that we will start with a more local concern, I decided, turning back to Diathed after a quick consultation with Ogi in Japanese. It's long past time for the Rising Sun Association, and through it the Kozuki organization, to assert control over all of Shinjuku. The surviving gangs represent an unnecessary complication in our plans and are a drain on our resources and attention. Their continued operation also flies in the face of the mission of the Benevolent Association. Gangs? Diathed looked slightly put out. You're just focusing on gangs? That's rather pedestrian. Quite boring, in fact. Strong empires require steady foundations, I retorted, and clearing the board here in Shinjuku will enhance our organizational footing. Besides, I think you might find this assignment interesting. After all, aren't you eager to shake up the comfortable, stagnant lives of the nobility? Oh? The fanatical glimmer returned to Diathed's eyes. Guilty as charged, but I don't see how 11 street gangs have much to do with the nobility. Where are you going with this? I'm putting your investigative and production skills to the test with a tight deadline. I smiled humorously at the newsman. Think of this as a crunch session. In 2 days, I want to turn on high TV and see a report about how select members of the local aristocracy have been undermining Clovis's reign and concealing taxable income from his administration via an alliance with local street gangs. Diathed worried at his lip for a moment, then shook his head. I can't fabricate something that big and expect it to run. It might get past the censors, if it even got that far.
Tangling with nobles means legal would get involved, which means corporate would need to see my evidence and sign off before I could get my script anywhere near a teleprompter.
Oh, no need to worry about fabricating anything, I replied dismissively. What's that Britannian phrase again?
The best lies have a grain of truth in them?
Well, I smiled at the newsman, letting just a hint of teeth show under my lip. In a few days, I will be providing you with all the evidence you could ever want when I handle them personally.
My smile dimmed and I gave him a pointed look.
However, if I simply cut down the weeds without pulling the root, they'll just come back.
Which is where you'll come in.
Well, you're definitely not boring, Diethard conceded, although his tepid praise was undermined by the renewed gleam in his eyes. Still, I'm not sure you're going to find a smoking gun sitting in some gang squat. I mean, I'm not doubting that some nobles are using local criminal groups as foot soldiers, but why would they write anything down?
Someone's got to take inventory,
I pointed out, and someone's got to be handling the money.
More to the point, I'm not trying to take the noble backers to court.
That's not the point of this operation. The point is that you make a big public stink about it,
phrasing their alleged activities as an insult to the vice-regal governor's royal dignity.
Clovis either publicly says that it isn't, making him look weak and foolish, or he acts. If he acts, he'll be isolating a slice of his backers, introducing further divisions into the settlement. I tried to ignore the expression of awe on Diethard's face. It was honestly disturbing, the way he was looking at me. He really is like another Shugel. And just like Shugel, he is utterly infatuated with his pet obsession. This is not a rational actor. Anyway, I continued briskly, it's about time for you to return to the settlement. Ogi will escort you to one of the brothels near the checkpoints, where you can blend in with the crowd and exit the ghetto. Please give him an email or a phone number where we can reach you. I assume you've handled confidential sources before, so use the same procedures. We'll be in touch to schedule a pickup for any materials we capture in the raids. Why yes. Absolutely. Diethard finally found his tongue, and all but bounced to his feet. Yes, it is time to go. 2 days? 2 days? I've got so much to do. He turned to Ogi, who was slowly standing from his chair. Come on, hurry up. I don't have a minute to lose. I exchanged nods with Ogi. Hurry on back, I commanded him, switching back to our language, and make sure you keep your radio on. Boar and Mallet should still be downstairs. I'll tell them to keep a discreet eye on you too. I chanced a quick look at Diethard, impatiently hovering near the door to the apartment we'd used as an improvised conference room. Don't trust him. No need to tell me twice, Ogi grumbled, ruffling my hair before he stumped his way across the room and out the door, closely followed by Diethard, who thankfully left without any pretense of a friendly goodbye. Finally alone, I leaned back in my chair and yawned, closing my eyes for a quick moment. I'd have to get back up soon, since I planned on spending the night in my usual place in the apartment I shared with the other 2 leaders of the Kozuki organization, but I let myself rest for a moment. It had been a long, long day, full of seemingly endless meetings. And tomorrow morning, I'll need to wake up early to see Ogi off. It would be strange, being away from the man after months at the school. It was good to be back, something I would never have thought about Shinjuku before enduring Major Onoda's company for an entire season. Hopefully Ogi can keep our other ally of convenience in check. It was almost enough to make me miss the clean divisions of my previous life. At least then everybody on our side had worn the same uniform. April 22, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0550. The next day began early, as Naoto and I woke early to see Ogi off as he began his journey back to Gunma. We ended up accompanying him halfway across Shinjuku before finally saying goodbye. Any further and our presence might have drawn attention to the lone man slipping out of Shinjuku and disappearing into the dawn. Then came a shared breakfast with Naoto, which started quite pleasantly but became quite fraught when I briefed him about Diethard. As I had anticipated, Naoto was very upset to hear that anybody had been stalking his beloved little sister for months, and decidedly disturbed that the newsman had managed to dig up so much information about her. Fortunately, he mastered his anger quickly enough and gave his retroactive blessing to my actions, agreeing that Diethard was a valuable enough tool to justify recruitment. Explaining why I was so certain that Diethard wouldn't betray us had taken some effort, but in the end Naoto accepted my logic. I still think you're playing with fire,
The leader of the Kozuki organization cautioned me, munching on a rice cake. The man's clearly fucked in the head. Who's to say that he won't find some new next big story to distract him, eh? And don't give me that mutually assured destruction crap. He waggled a finger at me from across the table for emphasis. The man was willing to walk straight into Shinjuku in a cashmere suit. He has no self-preservation instinct. I don't deny that in the slightest, Naoto, I sighed, taking a sip of my orange juice. Bless his heart, Naoto had remembered, or perhaps been reminded by Ogi, how much I had enjoyed the oranges. Fresh oranges were hard to come by, but my other roommate had stocked up on concentrate to make into juice. I'm not trusting his self-preservation to keep him in line. He signed up with us, after all. I just think that he's a deeply obsessive man who cares for nothing but his so-called great work. I know. Naoto grumbled slightly, taking another bite of rice cake. I'm not doubting you, nor your instincts. Kami knows, you've been right so far. It's perfectly understandable to dislike the man, I replied reasonably. Speaking frankly, I dislike the man as well. I was less than pleased to learn that he had been prying into Callan's affairs, and I would have shot him in the alleyway for the defense alone if I hadn't thought that he was more useful still breathing. Plus, I didn't want to have to haul the body all the way back out of the ghetto to obfuscate the circumstances of his passing. Naoto laughed, and the mood finally lightened as the last vestiges of his sulk dissipated. Yeah, for sure. How were you planning on pulling that off, Tanya? Were you gonna magic him through the checkpoint? I could tell that the last question was only half joking at most. I couldn't blame him for his curiosity. Nothing so fanciful, I demurred, waving my hand as if to dissipate the idea into the ether, and nothing particularly complex either. There's no shortage of gang-infested subway tunnels around here, and at this time of year, there's got to be at least a few that aren't flooded. I'd just find my way through and leave the body somewhere on the other side of the wall. Which, I put down my cup, actually brings me to my next point. I think it's time to finish cleaning house, Naoto. You'd know best, as the man on the ground for the last few months, but in my opinion, we aren't going to get a better opportunity anytime soon. Not until the next cohort graduates from the school, at least. Oh? The redhead leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. It was amazing how much better he looked after a single good night of sleep, plus the 2 full meals Ogi and I had supervised. While the dark shadows were still under his eyes, some of the exhaustion lines had faded, and some of the color had returned to his waxy skin. Before putting him to bed the previous night, Ogi had forced his best friend into the icy shower, dealing with the worst of the stench as well as the rough stubble, now cleanly shaved away. Instead of dead on his feet, Naoto just looked worn to the bone. Yes, I replied firmly. I'm firmly convinced that now is the best time to strike at the surviving gangs. If we wait too long, information about the newly trained fighters will leak out, reducing their effectiveness. I paused, realizing that I'd slipped up already. Hadn't I just reminded myself of how skilled Naoto was as a leader the night before? I had been so impressed by his achievements in Shinjuku that I'd recommitted myself to following his guidance while implementing my plans. All of that had gone by the wayside as I'd recruited Reed at my own initiative, without consulting the leader, the one who had guided Shinjuku's rebuilding project over the last 3 months. I just got back and I'm already overstepping my authority. I got so used to a near-independent command that I forgot my place in the chain of command entirely. Naoto's generally relaxed, but if he thinks I'm trying to usurp his hard-won authority, I needed to make things right, before Naoto could build up a head of steam and become truly upset. A show of renewed submission would do the trick. Naoto, I apologize. I stood up from my chair and bowed, lowering my head and humbling myself before my leader. You're the one who's been fighting the gangs for the last several months, and you're the one who organized the local citizen militia. What are your plans? Please, let me help you refine and implement them. Naoto laughed. Oh yes, my great and mighty plans. I've got 'em, masterpieces all of them. He paused for a moment, looking at me expectantly. I kept my head lowered as my mind raced, trying to figure out what response he was looking for. Oh, come on Tanya. Naoto rolled his eyes, the amusement in his voice mingling with exasperation. Lift your head and sit back down. My plan at the moment is to listen carefully to what you have to say. You say it's time to go after the gangs? I agree. Oh. With careful grace, I returned to my seat, folded my hands in my lap, and looked back up at my leader, my face carefully blank. Thankfully, Naoto was merciful, and he gave me a moment to repair my dignity before continuing. I think we should probably grab Ino first, though. I've been pretty occupied, and I don't have a great grasp on how our supplies are looking at the moment. And Naoto had the grace to look away. I owe her an apology, I think. For almost working yourself to death? I asked, a hint of frost touching my voice. Yes, Naoto, you should apologize to Ino for that. And you should also apologize to her for offloading talking to Callan onto her shoulders. Callan's your sister, Naoto. Trying to cut her out of your life is bad enough, especially because you know that doing that just makes her more determined to be involved. Yeah. Ha, Naoto sighed, but with a fond smile. Man, Ino's really been doing a ton of good. I couldn't have done any of it without her, you know. She's the one who kept everybody fed, who found all the building supplies we needed, who got the work passes to get people into the settlement. It's pretty incredible, Tanya. Huh? I blinked, and frowned at Naoto. It sounds like. But, I was so sure that he and Ogi. I shook my head firmly. It doesn't matter. There is no reason to dig through a co-worker's personal life, even less to intrude on a friend's. She is definitely a fine quartermaster, I replied, and not a bad analyst either. In fact, she was the one who explained how the gangs in Shinjuku worked to me. Well, Naoto checked his watch and got to his feet. No time like the present. She's probably already up at the meeting hall. Breakfast is supposed to start in half an hour, so. Great, we can take the opportunity to feed you again. I followed Naoto out the door and down the stairs, continuing to expound on how work was no excuse to miss meals, absent-mindedly gesturing to Tsubuki and Kino as we passed through the lobby. The squad leader and her subordinate peeled themselves off the wall and fell into step behind us as we made the short walk to the Rising Sun's meeting hall. As expected, the meeting hall was already jammed full when we arrived. Less than an hour after dawn, and a queue already stretched out the door, full of surprisingly talkative people, all chatting with their neighbors or family members as they waited for their morning porridge. Inside, the central room was full of collapsible tables groaning under the weight of bowls, cups and elbows. People ate hurriedly, and as soon as a seat opened up the next person in the queue was waved in and a bowl of breakfast thrust into their hands. It took me a moment to find Ino in the swirl of bodies, before I eventually noticed her leaning against the wall by her office door, at the rear of the building. Almost at the same moment, Ino noticed our arrival. Tanya, you're back. The logistical officer of the Kozuki organization and the manager for the Benevolent Association's day-to-day operations bustled through the hall, clearing a path by force of personality alone. It's been way too long. You were supposed to come by last night for dinner. Did you forget how to get to the hall or something? As she fussed at me, Ino wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me close for a speedy, if warm, hug. After a second's delay, I returned the embrace before hastily letting go of her again. I had never particularly enjoyed shows of public affection, but, well, I wasn't in the military, and it was very important to maintain personal bonds within our organization, and equally important to show solidarity in the face of the general public. Besides, being hugged isn't that much of an imposition. Look at you, girl, Ino gushed, enthusiastically ruffling my hair and easily evading my half-hearted attempts to swat her hand away. To my embarrassment, I saw some of the people in the line smiling and chuckling at Ino's enthusiasm. You're not a stick anymore, are you? You're finally putting on some muscle, huh? And you must have gained, what? 5 centimeters? 6. It's good to see you too, Ino, I replied, somewhat lamely. Naoto gave me the highlights, but it sounds like you have both been very busy. Ogi and I were both astonished at how much Shinjuku has changed since we left. It's truly impressive. We've been keeping busy, Ino smirked, before turning to Naoto. Sobering up, she gave him a long, thorough look. He smiled awkwardly back, and displayed his strategic acumen by holding his tongue and waiting for Ino to have the first word. Naoto, I see that Ogi convinced you to actually sleep for a change. He also forced me to take a shower and clip my nails. Naoto rubbed his head, clearly anxious under Ino's glare. It kind of felt like I was 12 again. With a nervous chuckle, Naoto forced himself to straighten up and meet Ino's eyes. Look,
I'm sorry, Ino. I know I've been blowing you off lately.
Let's go to my office for this, Ino cut in, seemingly remembering where we all were.
No need to make this a public ordeal, after all. Moments later,
all three of us were in Ino's office, seated around a table hastily cleared of its stacks of folders. Somewhere along the way, Naoto and I had acquired bowls of porridge. I took an experimental bite, bland, but less than I'd expected.
Ino noticed my inquisitive look.
Curious about my secret recipe?
It's nothing too much, whatever cereal is cheapest, usually brown rice or millet, with onions and cheap meat finely chopped and stirred into boil with the grain. Each bowl costs less than 30 pence to make, since we buy all the ingredients in bulk.
I really wish that you'd been in charge of the common pot back when I was on the labor gangs, I replied honestly.
If we'd had this instead of the watery stuff we got.
It was hard to put the depth of the emotion into words. So many people had wasted away, spending calories that their bodies couldn't spare, just in the hope of warding off starvation for another day.
Things might have been different.
True enough, Ino agreed easily. But
that's our job now,
right?
To do the best we can to bring in a new day.
I nodded, and shut up to enjoy my porridge. Naoto, finally given the opportunity to speak, immediately took the plunge back into his interrupted apology. I'm sorry for blowing you off, and I'm sorry that I ended up pushing family stuff onto you, he began. I didn't mean to, but I should have expected Callan to be persistent.
And
I'm sorry that I was acting like such a prick and not eating or sleeping. I was supposed to be a leader, and I offloaded a ton of responsibility onto you.
Naoto, Ino sighed, I'm not angry with you.
I'm not even disappointed with you. I know that you throw yourself into whatever you do. You did that back in college, and you're still doing it now. I just wish that you'd.
She untied the bandana from around her head, letting her shoulder-length dark blue hair pour down her shoulders.
I just wish that you wouldn't get so damned obsessed.
Damn it.
And yes, stop ignoring Callan. I'm tired of running messages between the two of you.
That's not my job.
You're right, Naoto replied, doing his best to look as contrite as possible.
I should have handled that better. And
look, I know that you didn't tell me about how Callan and that Brit kid were talking. I'm sorry that I made myself unapproachable on the matter. That was stupid of me, he sighed heavily. I know I get defensive about Callan, and I know that it's stupid, but overreacting in the past to the point where you didn't tell me something that I really should have known was really stupid on my part.
I was in the wrong too on that, Ino admitted, resting her head on her hand.
I knew that I should have looped you in, but honestly, it looked like Callan had it handled. I knew you were, not at your best, and I figured that there was no point ruining a good thing, but I didn't really have the authority to make that call.
It could have been important.
Well, tell me next time, all right? Naoto smiled at Ino, the awkwardness gone and something like his familiar boyish charm came back again. I promise I'm not gonna bite your head off or throttle the kid.
I'll hold you to that,
Ino winked across the table, smirking at our fellow leader. But you know, some biting and choking could be okay, depending on how you play your cards, Kozuki. I choked on my porridge. Gah. Naoto jumped in his seat as I coughed up boiled grain, his face suddenly catching fire as he remembered that I was still here. Okay there, Tanya. My only response was a hacking cough. What do you think, moron? Let me get you some water, Tanya. Ino panicked, face blushing just as brightly as Naoto's, presumably since she realized she'd been flirting in front of a 12-year-old. The porridge can definitely be kinda sticky going down. You should take smaller bites. Smaller bites? I shrieked internally. You damned pent-up idiots. I was just trying to enjoy my meal when you suddenly just. Gah. I held in a ragged cough just long enough to shoot the two horny morons a smoldering glare that let them know exactly how amused I was about my brush with death via porridge.
Right.
It's,
good to be cautious.
Naoto, at the very least, looked appropriately apologetic. Ino, the infernal minx, now had a damned smile on her face despite her blush. You still want that water, Tanya? I'll be fine, I rasped as I massaged my sore throat, doing my best to be professional if no one else wanted to be an adult in the room. Moving on?
Naoto still looked embarrassed as he nodded, looking away slightly. Ino, on the other hand, had no shame. So, how was your trip to the mountains, Tanya? She smiled brightly, utterly unrepentant. Did you make any new friends? It was quite educational, I replied coolly, not rising to the bait. And indeed, I think I have an idea in mind to demonstrate just how much I and the other returnees picked up over the spring. But, I will need your input, as well as Naoto's, to make it work. Almost 3 hours later, I said my goodbyes to Naoto in front of the meeting hall. Regrettably, we each had full schedules for the day, and I likely wouldn't get the chance to see him again until evening. It was all important work though, and the core of leadership is obligation. While Naoto went off to his scheduled weekly meeting with the Assembly of Local Notables, I veered east. Off to meet two of my own obligations, one long overdue. I found Tanaka Chihiro high above the streets of Shinjuku, holed up with her 3 surviving snipers as well as a company's worth of other armed women in a crumbling hotel off Naka Street. Coincidentally, the hotel she'd chosen to make her personal stronghold was located only 2 blocks away from the collapsed office building sealing the tomb once known as Shinjuku Gyome Station. Fortunately for me, the Shinjuku ghetto community grapevine was just as strong and well-connected as I'd remembered. News of my appearance at the meeting hall had already spread to the handful of guards outside the former hotel's entrance. While they were only crudely armed with homemade spears and knives, all 4 of the visible guards looked very competent with their cruelly edged weapons, and it had been a relief when they just smiled at me and waved me inside. Chihiro was less delighted to see me. So, you're back, huh? The hotel room, peeling walls spattered with mildew, stank of unwashed bodies and the cheap but strong hooch commonly brewed in Shinjuku. Took you long enough. We've been busy as hell here while you were fucking around in Gunma. I stopped a foot into the room. Chihiro was sprawled over the moldering queen-sized bed, drunk at 9 in the morning though thankfully still dressed. Her face, pitted with a multitude of tiny burn scars, was even more blotchy than I remembered, and her typically short-cropped hair had been shaved away entirely. And not by a skilled barber either, judging by that cut over her ear. Good morning, Mr. Naka, I replied, stepping over a discarded pair of pants and discreetly running my eyes over the room. Thankfully, the scoped rifle Naoto had once given her, a gift courtesy of some gang's armory, leaned in the corner by the door, far away from its intoxicated owner. It's been quite some time. How is your sister doing? Chika? Chihiro's face twisted for a moment, before settling back into her disdainful sneer. You've probably seen her more recently than I have. She spends all her time out at the meeting hall now, helping Kasumi and Ino, which is fine. Would you rather she be here with you? I asked, not trying to needle the mercurial woman but genuinely curious. I'd never really understood Chihiro. She was fanatical in her antipathy towards all things Britannian, she always leapt at the chance to inflict violence, and she had a strange love-hate relationship with men in general. On the other hand, before I'd left for 3.5 months, she'd also been very close to her younger sister, her sole surviving family member. Obviously. Chihiro swung her legs off the bed and rose until she was seated upright. But she refuses to pick up a weapon, not even a knife. I tried so hard to get her to join me, since, you know, we've got an extra rifle and all. And the little idiot refused. I see. I didn't, but Chihiro's family life was her own problem. As long as Chika wanted to help, I was confident Ino would appreciate the extra hands. Still, it was time to get to the reason I'd climbed 5 sets of stairs to visit this squalid room. I'm sorry to hear about Makoto. It's very hard, losing someone under your command. How are your other subordinates taking it? How do you think? Chihiro snorted incredulously. Having a ball of a time with it, obviously. Fuck's sake, I thought you were supposed to be smart. And that's about enough of that. I had come to visit Chihiro in good faith, and all I had gotten in exchange was unwarranted abuse. The temptation to slap the smirk off of Chihiro's face was almost overwhelming. I'm better than that. Besides, it's not my job to keep discipline in the ranks. Thank you very kindly for your hospitality, Mr. Naka. My voice was flat, measured, and cold. I will give your regards to your sister. Hopefully she will be happy to hear that you're still alive. I will also pass on your regards to Naoto and Tamaki for their consideration of disciplinary action. I turned on my heel and stalked out of the room. "We have an operation planned for tomorrow," I called back over my shoulder as I left, "and if you show up drunk, I will feed you your own rifle." While I left the crumbling hotel in something of a huff, I still took the time to stop and speak with the guards on duty, complimenting them on their diligence, promising them better gear and action more exciting than standing sentry soon, and generally getting to know the members of the small militia that had congregated around Chihiro and her squad. Every woman had her own story of her own path to the rising sun. Some had stories very similar to my own, long hours spent in back-breaking labor, with the prospect of a better life allure leading to nothing but another day with a hungry belly. Others, the former sex workers jumping at the chance to get some power back after years of helplessness, had stories that reminded me of someone else entirely. Plenty had signed up after the Christmas incident, and some had been rescued from gang strongholds while I was away in Gunma. All told, 132 stories, of which I only had the chance to hear a 3 to 4 sentence highlight before bowing and moving on. All 132 were united under the banner of the rising sun, and were united in their unwillingness to ever consider relinquishing their weapons. A particularly angry girl, offended by my question, pointed out that she could be put up against a wall and shot any day, so there was no reason not to fight. She was very surprised when I clapped her on the shoulder and told her I'd used that same line myself when I joined. I spent 2 hours glad-handing and talking to the militia women, as well as Misato, one of Chihiro's snipers. While I was their leader by dint of institution, I wasn't a leader they knew personally, or really had any reason to trust. For the most part, that would be fine, so long as the leader they were personally loyal to trusted me. With Chihiro's personal dislike for me just as intransigent as always, I needed to give these militia members a distinct reason to trust in me personally. After I passed on my condolences about Makoto to Misato and asked her to convey my sympathies to Aina and Inori, I finally left the ruin on Naka Street. I had another home visit to make, another obligation to discharge. The tiny room was just like any of the others in the tenement, clean and orderly. The people who lived here cared about their home, and wanted it to look nice. It showed an investment and an interest in the future. Altogether, it was a lovely contrast to Chihiro's wretched hotel room, but kneeling on a cushion in Sumire's apartment made me long for my reluctant comrade's abrasive company. Instead, Sumire's husband knelt on his own pillow, across a low table from me. His remaining arm cradled his son, almost 4 and looking at me with big, curious eyes, in his lap. I couldn't say that I saw any of Sumire in her son. Babies and children had always looked more or less the same to me, across all of my lives, and I'd generally done my best to avoid them when possible. No escape was possible from this child, so that's it, then. The words fell from Mr. Tokahaku's lips like paper, slowly wafting down to the ground and landing too softly to hear. Scarcely a whisper. That's it, then. Sumire's gone. I doubt it will help, but she died a hero, I replied absently, my eyes caught on the boys. She and another comrade covered their squad's retreat. Everybody else made it out alive, thanks to their sacrifice. I see. Silence filled the room as Mr. Tokahaku contemplated my reply. I waited patiently for his response. While I had many other things to do today, this was important. Was it worth it, then? Whatever it was you people did. Was it worth my wife's life? My son's mother's life? The man just wants reassurance, something to cling to. Sometimes, an easy answer is better, even if its veracity might be debatable. I should give him what he seeks. I can't answer that question, not in a way that will satisfy you, I replied instead of the vague platitude I'd lined up in advance for just such a question. She was not my wife, not my mother. I can't tell you that the loss you and your son will bear will ever be worth it, no matter what we accomplished. Damn it. I was just supposed to soothe him, not give an honest answer. I'd be a terrible politician. If you want the cold comfort of a more objective answer, I continued, deciding that the only way out of the hole I dug myself into was to dig deeper, then speaking as her commander, it was worth it. The operation was a success, and losses, while painful, were less than they could have been. Many Britannians died as a result of the operation, and Britannian interests in the operation area might very well be permanently impacted. I paused. Does that help? No. Mr. Tokahaku replied, no, it really doesn't. I'm happy that she was able to help others, but if you'll pardon me for saying it, Miss Hajime, I wish the rest of her squad, the ones who ran, had been the ones to die instead. You have the right to feel that way. His statement had been full of painful, quiet anger, held as tightly to him as his son. Far be it from me to deprive a freshly minted widower of the right to grieve. I don't doubt that I would feel exactly the same, were I in your position. My news delivered, I rose from the floor, came to attention, and bowed to the still kneeling Mr. Tokahaku. You and your son have the right to food, medical care, and financial and material assistance from the Kozuki organization, and from the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. If you need anything, from repairs for your apartment to a babysitter to oranges, come to the meeting hall. Do not hold back, we owe your family a debt of gratitude. The child gurgled, and the father bowed his head. I left the tiny, clean apartment, closing the door behind me. A good leader tends to their followers, and ensures that they are valued and cared for. Loyalty offered must be repaid, otherwise no one will ever be loyal to you. I fervently wished that I'd never have to make another such house call, but I knew that I wouldn't be so lucky. I knew that fulfilling my goals would demand a high price. I also knew that I would use every scrap of my knowledge and ability to drive that price down as far as I could, to make my number of house calls as low as possible. Loyalty and obligation. Duty and leadership. For the first time in weeks, I thought of my mother. Duty is a chain, and obligation is a burden. But in the end, it was a chain that you picked up willingly, didn't you, Mother? You had every reason and opportunity to throw me away, but you didn't. Was it worth it, in the end, for you? Was I worth it? April 23, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0103. The sounds of drunken laughter and throbbing bass spilled out from the building below me as a knot of intoxicated partygoers staggered out the front door. The noise blended with the cacophony of similar sounds escaping from the lesser brothels and clubs surrounding the former Shinjuku Bunker Theater. As always on the weekends, the outlets retailing hospitality only blocks away from the Kawadacho checkpoint were doing a brisk business. My business with the brothel under my feet had begun much earlier in the night. 3 hours earlier, I had mustered 2 of the 5-man squads I had brought back with me from the school. We had spent the intervening time slowly creeping into position, painstakingly picking our way through the many alleys and side streets of the ghetto. While I typically preferred blending in with the crowd to skulking in shadows, my unit was packing entirely too much military hardware to resemble a gang of laborers coming home after a long shift. Thankfully, the only tricky part had come when we'd arrived at the old theater building itself. Earlier reconnaissance by a pair of Naoto's Sun Guard militia had determined that 2 guards were posted on the roof, while the sentries were seemingly tasked with keeping watch over the street outside the gang's headquarters and thus more focused on looking out than guarding the roof itself. Both had rifles and at least one had a. They had noticed our ascent. It could have led to all kinds of complications. So we climbed the brick exterior very, very slowly. The mortar was badly decayed after 6 years without maintenance, presenting abundant finger and toe holds. By the time I had quietly pulled myself over the lip of the rear wall, at the head of the advancing unit, my shoulders and arms burnt despite my enhancements. I'll have to thank Onoda, assuming he hasn't attempted to appropriate the school for the JLF, I mused, ducking behind the wall sheltering the entrance to the internal stairwell as the rest of my unit clambered over the top. If it wasn't for all of those exercises, I don't know if I could have made that climb. Soon enough, all the members of A and B squads were hunkered down behind the stairwell's wall, which meant that it was time to wait. My unit was not the only group of Kozuki organization members and auxiliaries out and about tonight, and in order for the plan to work, we all had to synchronize our efforts. And on that note, I slid my hand down to my pocket and pulled out the burner phone I'd picked up from Mr. Asahara yesterday afternoon, along with a number of other useful tools. I sent a text to the one number saved in the contacts, before flipping the phone closed and returning it to my pocket. I wasn't expecting a response. If things were going according to plan, the next time the phone vibrated, it would be time for action. After a short eternity of 12 minutes, I felt a buzz against my pocket. As I reached down again, I could almost feel the tension as 10 sets of eyes tracked the motion. I quickly flipped the phone open, and grinned at the message. Ino had been confused when I'd suggested Tora as our go sign, but she'd indulged me. Flipping the phone closed, I peered around the wall. The two sentries were leaning against the lip of the building, looking out onto the street below, and appeared to be smoking. I returned the phone to my pocket, and drew the knife hanging off my belt before gesturing to Tsubaki, although for tonight, she was B1. I held up my empty right hand, and gestured at her, and she nodded. Message received, just as we'd trained. Carefully, I padded out from around the rooftop access, moving smoothly and deliberately. I wasn't too worried about the sounds of my boots on the gravel, considering the sheer volume of noise from down below, but I didn't want to make any sudden motion that might catch in one of the target's peripheral vision. I angled towards the guard on the left, the further of the pair, as B1 broke off towards his partner. We got closer and closer, the two men still utterly unaware of our presence. Both had propped their rifles next to them, and neither seemed to have any other weapon. My target had a walkie-talkie clipped to a belt loop. I would have to move fast. They were talking, but I couldn't hear about what. It didn't matter. From the corner of my eye, I saw B1 slowly raise her empty right hand as she approached her target, just the same as I had done. Then, I was focused only on the man in front of me, the way his stink, cigarettes, sweat, and body odor filled my nose, and how he still hadn't noticed me. And then, just as Onoda had instructed, I thrust my right hand forward, past the side of his neck, and grabbed his chin. I poured energy into my strength enhancement as I rose up, lunging forwards on my tiptoes, mashing his jaw shut and forcing his head up and back in a single smooth motion. The knife in my left hand flashed forwards, the scarce illumination of the scattered and weak lights of this corner of Shinjuku glittering off the polished steel, before I rammed the blade into the side of my target's neck, slamming it in as hard as I possibly could, forcing the wedge through the muscle and into the vital bundle of tubes within. I heard a gurgling scream, but I didn't know whether it came from my target, or from B1's. Gritting my teeth, I twisted down hard on my knife, forcing the wound wide open, and jerked the blade forwards. It tore free from his neck just above the shoulder, leaving an ugly gash of a wound behind. My target was still thrashing limply, so I kept my right hand in place, holding his mouth shut and pulling him back over me. I took a half step back, dragging him with me to make sure he didn't topple forwards off the roof. Dropping my knife to the gravel surface below, I grabbed the radio off his belt, and with a bit of groping managed to clip it to the back of my own belt. I'm probably getting blood all over this shirt. I couldn't help but laugh internally at the petulant thought. It was an utterly trivial concern, but the thrifty survival habits of earlier years were hard to shake. Speaking of survival, the hand over his mouth felt no breath, and he'd stopped thrashing. Below the heel of my right hand, I felt no pulse in his surviving carotid artery. Satisfied that the man was quite dead, I lowered the corpse to the ground and looked up to check on B1's progress, and saw that she was rising back to her feet, just as blood-soaked as I probably was. Objective complete. I gestured, and the remaining 9 members of my team hustled over to join us. Squad B, my voice was raspy and harsh after hours of minimal conversation, not to mention the hard climb. You're up top. Squad A, you're with me on the cross and on point. Let's go. Waiting just long enough to see 10 acknowledging nods, I turned and opened the door to the internal stairwell. The knob turned easily. Between the incompetent guards and the absence of any lock, the 11 lords, the gang based out of the old theater, clearly hadn't placed much of a premium on security, relying on intimidation in place of preparation. A good sign. The stairwell was dark, without any functional light sources illuminating the narrow path through the accumulated detritus and trash. This wasn't part of the brothel headquarters where guests were allowed, and I doubted the gang's officers came here either. Fortunately, that meant we'd have the element of surprise for a bit longer. I reached over my shoulder, and grabbed the barrel of my newly issued rifle, ducking under the strap as I unlimbered my weapon. It was a bit large for my frame, but I knew from experience at the school that I could easily compensate for that with my strength enhancement. I was fortunate that the coil guns of this world had such minimal recoil, compared to the chemical propellant weapons of my previous world, otherwise I would have been stuck bringing a pistol to this mission. The knapsack that had hung just below the coil gun rattled as I hoisted my weapon, heavy with as much extra ammunition as I could carry, as well as the cylindrical devices I had picked up from Mr. Asahara last evening. Just like the rest of my soldiers, I had packed simply but not lightly for this mission: rifle, 5 30-round magazines, 3 of the freshly acquired devices, and my phone. It would in all likelihood be more than enough. Then, With a quick breath in and out, I gingerly took the first step down into the dark of the stairwell. The darkness was difficult, but not impossible to navigate, and thankfully, we were only going down a single floor's worth. Every jostle and every scuff rang like a heavy bell as my 10 comrades followed me, but I knew that I could only hear those sounds because I was focused on them. We were professional, and our enemies were foolish and unaware. After the 5 men of A Squad navigated the last few steps, I carefully cracked the door to the theater's interior open. This was the point where the mission started to get somewhat risky. We didn't have any contacts inside the 11 Lords, so we didn't know what the interior of the theater looked exactly like now, other than the basic knowledge of where the main stage was. Fortunately, as the door slowly opened, there wasn't that much to see. The mezzanine lobby had been divided up into some improvised rooms, with a hallway of sorts connecting the doorway I hid behind to the 2 sets of central stairs leading down to the main lobby. I could see a pair of men in ill-fitting suits standing by the nearest entrance to the amphitheater balcony, but apart from the 2 bored-looking men, the only other present stood just inside the closest room. A lone man, a refrain addict judging by his wild and feverish declarations as well as the track marks on his arms, was shouting at a pair of tired-looking women in soiled lingerie, while an older man in very ragged clothes tiredly pulled the sheets off a queen-sized bed. I waited, listening to the addict ramble for a moment, before leaning back inside the stairwell. 3 present, I muttered to A Squad, as well as B Squad behind them. 1's tripping. Low priority. The 2 by the entrance are sober. Plan 3. Not needing to wait for a reply, I stepped aside from the door, and let A2 and A3, both significantly bulkier than me, pass before slipping out myself, A1 by my side and A4 and A5 behind me. The important thing here was to minimize noise for as long as possible. Judging by the sounds, the lobby down below and the theater inside were packed full of people, and the longer they remained ignorant of our presence, the better. A2 and A3 were picture perfect in their takedowns of the 2 suited guards, the pair a credit to Major Anoda's expert tutelage. Before either of the targets realized it, my comrades were on top of them. The guard furthest away got out a quickly muffled squawk of surprise, but that was all. Meanwhile, as the rest of A Squad and I jogged towards the nearest central set of stairs leading to the house lobby, I could hear the very brief sounds of struggle as 2 of B Squad sent the refrainer to sleep. Thankfully, the apparent slaves didn't make a peep that I could hear. I slowed down and crept up to the very top of the stairs, and looked down the other half of the mezzanine. The upper level only had a matching set of bored guards idly chatting by the other entrance. They'd be my first target. Then, I looked down into the lobby. The 11 Lords had climbed to the top of the Shinjuku flesh trade on the dual strengths of their connections and their skill at marketing their flagship establishment to the seedy yet upmarket crowd of decadent Britannians looking for something special. Their slick presentation and the wide range of debaucheries for sale got the crowds in through the door, and their alliance with the crowned heads, the gang with the largest laboratories in Shinjuku, meant that party favors were always available. And so, it truly wasn't a surprise that the lobby was jam-packed with a crowd that was almost half Britannian, clustered around a variety of what I could only call side shows, for all that the term made light of what those shows consisted of. Gang members in tacky gilded jackets, dripping with frogging, hobnobbed and chatted with the crowd, presumably offering all kinds of wares, ranging from drugs to tickets for the main floor show inside the theater to a more private and specialized show. I looked back, and saw that B Squad were clustered around the door to the mezzanine. I didn't see any sign of the 3 slaves we'd passed, although if they had any sense they were hiding up on the roof, or at least in the stairwell. I caught B1's eye, and lifted 2 fingers to my brow. She nodded, returned the salute, and slammed the door to the balcony open and disappeared inside, followed by the rest of her squad. Ready grenades, I hissed the command as I focused on pushing mana into my basic enhancement suite. Reality drew into sharp focus. The reactive enhancement overclocked my mind's processors, making the world seem to move slower as my perception sharpened, while my muscles itched with their sudden potential, waiting to unleash a wave of violence. I'll suppress. All 5 of you throw as soon as we hear B go. Before I could get the word out, someone yelled from inside the balcony, followed immediately by 3 cracks as someone fired a burst from their coil gun. Damn it, Tsubaki must have run into resistance. Our cover's blown. Now. Now. Before the first of the devices cleared the stair railing, I was on my feet,
the butt of my rifle firmly pressed into my shoulder, and the pair of suits in the iron sights. I caressed the trigger, softly squeezing it, and the fiberglass butt jerked back into my shoulder as 3 5mm bullets hyper-accelerated down the magnetic rail in a fraction of a second. I didn't linger on my first target, immediately tracking the barrel onto the second target even as I squeezed down again. As soon as I saw the suit jerk, I let go of my rifle, letting it swing from its strap as I spun on my heel. I dropped back down onto my knees below the stone railing of the old stairs and jammed my hands over my ears just in time. From below, the noises of consternation and growing confusion from the party guests and gangsters aware enough to notice the gunfire above their heads suddenly vanished, overwhelmed by a wall of pure sound. Before the screeching tinny echo died away, I was back in my feet and my rifle was back in my hands. The rest of my squad weren't far behind me. By the time I'd lined up my sights on a gangster whose jacket bulged with a poorly hidden handgun, A4 was already firing on another target. The lobby erupted into pandemonium, as the deafened and blind crowd realized that it was under attack. Britannian and Japanese, client and criminal, slaver and enslaved, all exploded into a mad scramble for cover and safety. I fired a burst into the back of a man scrambling for the door, and the woman next to him screamed as his blood splashed across her face. As one, the crowd turned and rushed for the presumed safety of the theater itself, trampling the slow, the bound, and the unfortunate, spurred on by our unmerciful fire as we continued to rake the back of the crowd. The theater proved no refuge. I saw a brief flash of white light from the double door, wide open and choked with bodies, and I heard the same roar as B Squad threw their first round of Asahara's stolen flashbangs down from the balcony, closely followed by their own hail of gunfire. When I was a young man, literal lifetimes ago, I had once witnessed an exhibition of classic fishing techniques. One of those techniques suddenly came to mind, as I swapped my rifle's magazine and fired again into the panicking crowd, a technique where the school of fish was guided into increasingly smaller nets, until they were so tightly packed together that none could move. Then, the fishermen would lift the entire school out of the water, onto the boat, and beat all of the fish to death with oars. In essence, my two squads were using that same technique. When the crowd fled from the punished hail of gunfire in the theater, they ran straight into A Squad's line of sight. When they were herded back into the theater, Squad B fired down at them from the balcony. And when they tried to huddle under the balcony and against the wall, where we couldn't get them. Next round, go. Each soldier had left the meeting hall with 3 flashbangs, and there was really no need to be stingy. The eye-searing light lashed out again, the deafening sound drove the bloodied mass back out into the open, and the soldiers who had ducked behind the railing and covered their ears stung them once again with a fresh hail of gunfire. Of course, the fact that we weren't trying to kill all of the fish trapped in our nets made things a bit more tricky. While I had no interest in taking any of the gangsters or their clients alive, I wanted as little innocent blood on my hands as possible. I'd ordered my men to shoot with care, reminding them that the enslaved Japanese weren't willingly servicing the twisted desires of Britannian and 11 tyrants. Still, in the tangled throng of desperately rushing forms, only so much discretion was possible. The crowd had begun to thin out by the time my squad was forced to reload, and the surviving targets grew increasingly canny in their attempts to escape their fate. I saw some try to hide among the bodies, only to cringe at the sudden detonation of a nearby flashbang, or to recoil when some other desperate figure tripped over them. A Britannian tried to hide behind a collared woman, and I winced as both were cut down. Then, I saw a few of the luckier gangsters scramble through a door I was reasonably confident led to what had once been the theater's backstage offices. Those would have to be a priority. If the 11 lords had likewise been using those rooms, I couldn't let the escapees destroy or conceal any of the paperwork I was hoping to recover. A4. I elbowed the man next to me, and waited until he lowered his rifle and turned to me. Go tell B1 that A1 and I are going into the office. Keep up the pressure, but let her know that she has command of the rest of A Squad too. She can start cleanup when she's ready. Yes, ma'am. A4 slung his rifle over his shoulder and hastily trotted away as I turned and tapped on A1's shoulder. We need to get into the office, I shouted over the cacophony of -2, -3, and 5S rifles. I saw a few other rats scramble inside. Understood. The squad leader stepped back from the line, and started yelling at the remaining 3 riflemen. Listen up, you bastards. Backpack and I are heading into the office.
We'll be able to handle ourselves, so there's no need for you to shoot the place up while we're inside. I'll be very, very angry if any of you shoot me, got it?" A collection of eyes later, A1 and I descended down the stairs into the lobby. A knot of bodies covered the last few steps. It looked like at least some of the 11 lords had realized where we were shooting from after the first flashbang, and instead of panicking and running like the rest of the crowd had tried to climb the stairs and dislodge us. Unfortunately for them, one of my soldiers had dealt with their attempt, and I hadn't even noticed in the confusion and noise. The lobby was an absolute slaughterhouse, the floor choked with the dead and the dying. Broken fingers scratched at my trousers as bloodied faces turned upwards, begging for help, for relief, for an end to the hammering from above. The carpeting was soaked with blood, and squelched unpleasantly as I picked my way carefully across the killing ground, rifle in my hands. Most of the blood and filth, fortunately, came from the heaped-up corpses of Britannians and their lackeys, but a few innocent eyes met mine, accusation in their cold glances. I continued to approach the office, finger on my trigger, ready to put down any gangsters who might rise up from hiding places amongst the fallen. A1 followed 2 paces behind me and 1 to my right, carefully checking for any stray gangsters hiding up against the wall of the staircase. A squad had turned into a shooting platform. The deafening, rupturing crack of a flashbang echoed out from the theater, and few survivors broke and ran, sprinting from the shadows of the theater hall itself with wild-eyed desperation. They barely made it 2 meters into the open before the bullets slashed down from above. I watched as a girl only a few years older than me, a collar chafing her neck, pitched forward and slammed face first into the floor, a quarter of her head missing. There was no time to reflect on the terror I'd briefly glimpsed in the slave's eyes before she'd been cut down with dispassionate, if erroneous, efficiency. Someone, presumably one of the lucky few who had scrambled to temporary safety within, had locked the door to the office. Perhaps they had been trying to keep me out, perhaps they simply wanted to keep the rest of the crowd out. Either way, while the lock was still shiny and fresh, the door itself was not. Old, weathered, and presumably poorly maintained. Simultaneous kicks from A1 and I easily tore it off its hinges, the lock's bolt tearing free of the frame as the door gave way. As soon as the door thudded into the office, I hurled myself down in a forward roll, my rifle cradled against my chest as I followed my shoulder to the floor. I came up in a half kneel, finger on the trigger and rising up on my left foot as I quickly scanned the office. Behind me, A1 dove through the door and skidded on his knee pads to the dubious safety of a battered filing cabinet. Thanks to our dynamic entry, the welcoming salute from the rats hiding behind the overturned desk near the back of the room went high, the wild spray of bullets pulverizing the drywall and sending a storm of snowy flakes down onto our heads. How kind of them to broadcast their positions. I didn't bother trying for anything fancy, this wasn't a shooting gallery, and I wasn't here to show off. I simply returned fire, straight through the impromptu, yet insufficient, desktop sanctuary. The hyper-accelerated rounds easily tore through the particle board and, judging by the screams and the lack of returning fire, through the men and women who had been sheltering behind the desk. In the interest of thoroughness, I held the trigger down and emptied my magazine into the desk, in case anybody had considered playing possum. Reloading, I grunted, slotting a new magazine into the receiver behind the trigger guard. I kept my eyes moving, scanning every corner and niche of what had been a surprisingly neat office, looking for any other stragglers. "Do you see anybody?" "No," A1 replied, "I think you might have got them all." He swallowed heavily, and I could see his Adam's apple bob under the scarf wound around his face. "Good shooting?" "Good," I replied briskly, "then you can keep watch on the door." A1 kept a dutiful eye for any further hostiles, as the sounds of Tsubaki, B1's, assault continued outside the office. As the sounds of the cleanup operation continued, I quickly searched the office. Most would be surprised to learn how much paperwork a gang like the 11 Kings had, but I had counted on it. Just like any other profit-making organization, a gang had to account for income streams, expenditures, and outlays. They had to track inventory and payroll, and compile reports for backers and higher-ups. Fortunately, it seemed like the gang's leadership had opted to do most of their business on paper, and I quickly found 2 ledgers, one of which looked like a black book, a list of frequent customers often kept by brothels. The 11 Kings seemed to have shunned computers, perhaps reasoning that electronic records were a security risk. The entire office only contained a single laptop, a shiny aluminum-jacketed device that has unfortunately caught at least 2 bullets in the fracas. My eyes narrowed as I noticed that a cable was still attached to one of the computer's ports. It looked like it was supposed to connect to a device, but I couldn't see anything that looked like a digital storage unit anywhere near the workstation. I spared a look down at the tangle of bodies slowly filling the office with the scent of mixed blood and shit as their bowels relaxed in death. One of them had dressed nicely, in a somber suit instead of the usual gangster tat. In fact, the suit looked far too subdued to be party wear, which made it unlikely that he was a guest either. Perhaps he was once some sort of retainer for one of the customers? Or perhaps he's the accountant? I heaved the body up from the pile, pouring more energy into my strength enhancement as I lifted it up onto the broken remnants of the perforated desk. He'd been a well-fed man in life, at least by Shinjuku standards, and I grunted with relief when I dropped his bulk down onto the surface. I quickly ran my hands over his pockets, and just as I'd hoped, found a matte black cube in his jacket, featureless except for a port that matched the free end of the cable. The cube and the cable joined the 2 ledgers in my knapsack, followed by the possible accountant's wallet. While the high-denomination pound notes inside would be useful, I was more interested in his ID and cards. If he'd been managing the drive, he might have put a password on it. Having his basic information on hand could be very handy in that situation. After a moment's thought, I shoved the remnants of the laptop into the bag too. Perhaps the drive can be recovered? I continued to scour the office, stuffing receipts, correspondence, and anything else that looked vaguely important into my bag, cramming the nylon sack full. While extinguishing a faction competing for control over Shinjuku was the primary justification for this raid, seizing the gang's records had been the true objective of the night's work. With Diethard's much vaunted production skills and plentiful connections, those records would be a hammer blow to either Noble credibility or Clovis's reputation. A net win for the Japanese, no matter which party ended up burnt. Backpack? I heard B1's voice from the door. Are you about done there? The rest of the building's been emptied. I think I've found everything worthwhile, I replied, slinging my pack onto my back and picking my rifle back up from where I'd leaned it against the desk. Report. Any casualties or problems? No, ma'am. A totally clean sweep. I followed A1 out of the office, and joined B1 and her combined squads in the lobby. The men were scattered around the room, and despite the presumed eradication of the opposition, I was proud to see that their guards were still up and their eyes still scanning for threats. A knot of women and girls huddled in the middle of the lobby, most of them in varying states of undress. I don't think we had any runners either. I had A4 and -5 stick around by the front door, just in case, and all of the side doors were chained up from the inside. A very unsafe practice, but probably put in place to keep any of their victims from escaping, I mused, casting my eyes over the lobby and noticing how many of the sprawling bodies had collars around their necks, despite my earlier instructions. My stomach twisted uneasily. I'd known that it was all but inevitable that some of the slaves would get caught, but there's so many. It's ironic because it meant that the bastards had nowhere to run once we showed up. B1 fell into step behind me as I walked towards the theater itself. I guess that is irony, isn't it? It is, I acknowledged, and yes, that was one of the reasons I find the situation ironic. One of 2. By the way, can't you find them some blankets or something? I gestured back towards the lobby where the newly freed women huddled. One of the men, who'd clearly been eavesdropping, startled and saluted, before heading up the stairs purposefully. The theater was as tasteless as I'd anticipated, complete with an array of garish lights and a spotlight still moving on an automated track, playing over the 3 poles on the stage, as well as the front rows of the house. The middle area had been set up more like a dining area, with plenty of small tables and comfortable chairs, and the rear had been divided into a number of shadowy booths and semi-enclosed rooms. The decor, lurid at the best of times, had been turned nightmarish with the application of the gore of at least 100 bodies. Oh? B1 primly stepped over a badly trampled arm, the bone protruding from the skin and the flesh black and pulpy, stamped into formlessness by hundreds of frantic feet. What's the other reason? Well, we ensured that a fair number of their victims will never escape their captivity, unless you count death. My tone was cool and detached, the sick heat in my gut was anything but. I know that civilian casualties are sadly inevitable, especially when in situations as chaotic as that mob, but
It truly is a pity that we couldn't aim solely for the pimps and the clients.
Not to sound callous. Tsubuki's voice was tentative, trailing off into an implicit question, and I waited for her to continue.
Not to sound callous, but what else were you expecting with that plan, Mom?
I'm not questioning it or anything, it worked great.
But I am kinda surprised that you're upset about it.
It was my plan, I acknowledged, and we completed the objectives we set out to meet with it. Hopefully, our comrades are having similar levels of success. And yes, I knew that it was highly likely that innocents would get caught in the crossfire. I had hoped to be proven wrong, and I'd hoped it would only be one or two.
Optimistic, I know,
but that's just what happens, Tanya. Tsubuki was blunt, but not cruel. Her warm hand on my shoulder was comforting. I mean, I'm not telling you to not hope for the best, but always plan for the worst.
I know.
I closed my eyes, and breathed in, then out. I expect I'll countenance far worse before we are done, Tsubuki. I hate to acknowledge it, but we are at war, and cannot afford the luxury of squeamishness. Civilians die in times of war just as much as soldiers, if not far more. My words rang hollow, for all that I spoke with complete sincerity. I wondered who I was trying to convince. Any one of them could have been Mother. They could have been me, if things had gone differently. I wondered if I could have planned the mission differently. Perhaps we could have struck when the girls, the slaves, had been off the floor. Maybe if we'd attacked before they opened for the night or after closing. But if we had, we would have missed the chance to catch the esteemed clientele. Just killing the pimps without touching the clients would have all but guaranteed the rise of a replacement organization elsewhere. To truly achieve a lasting effect, innocents had to be present, serving as bait in the center of our trap. Did leaders of the rebel groups of my youth express similar sentiments? Every Britannian they had killed had brought death to 100 Japanese, and I had witnessed several of the mass executions personally. How many Japanese had I condemned to death for tonight's work? I'd estimated half the crowd was Britannian, so 100? 150? Multiplied 100-fold. Of course, that presupposes that the Britannians realized that the gunmen were Japanese. The flashbangs I had purchased from Mr. Asahara were, like all of the weapons sold by the 6 houses, Britannian Army issue, as with the rifles and ammunition used in the night's raid. When considered along with the opinions of Japanese intelligence and organizational ability held by the general Britannian population, it was entirely possible that the blame would be assigned to some other Britannian faction who had come to massacre some subhuman competition. The clients may have been people, but the gang were just 11s, after all. Of course, it's entirely possible that the Britannians will still just default to flailing around wildly and killing every Japanese person they can find, but frankly, that's a risk no matter what we do. We could all just sit on our hands, and they'd still kill us on a lark. I smiled bitterly to myself at the thought. It was still shocking at times just how badly managed the occupation of Japan truly was, and how the policies were so short-sighted that they'd driven a law-abiding person such as myself into armed rebellion. We're done here. I shoved my private introspection on what could have been away, down into the dark. Navel-gazing was never productive, and I was still on the clock. B1, get the rest of the squad together. Force open one of the side doors, we'll exit out that way. Once we're out, your squad is tasked with getting the rescued prisoners to Chihiro. If she's drunk or pissy, take them to Ino instead. Yes, Mom. The warm hand left my shoulder, and B1 trotted back to the lobby, already shouting for the men to form up. I took a moment to commit the theater to memory, and turned to follow her. I walked out of the charnel pit with my shoulders back and my head up. I regretted the deaths of those slaves who had been unlucky enough to get caught in the crossfire, the people who I had wanted to help and protect, but I couldn't slow down and let myself think too much about it. I was at war, and I would prosecute it to the greatest of my ability. When the cost of defeat was the death or slavery of my entire people, any means was justifiable, so long as it represented a net benefit. That was key, their deaths had to be justifiable. I had no desire for wanton death among my people, but I could not afford to be squeamish, especially since my enemy had no such qualms. Any means, even if it meant the death of daughters, sisters, fathers and sons, or mothers. I didn't want to make any further house calls to the widows and orphans of my comrades, but in the end, it would be worth it. There will be plenty of time for regret and self-castigation later. I will make sure that the loss of civilian life isn't forgotten when this is all said and done, but I will do what I must until then. All for the cause of a reborn Japan. Nothing less was worthy of the millions of losses I could lay at Britannia's door. There would be no rapprochement, there could be no cohabitation on these islands. Victory or death. April 23, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0700. The meeting hall was packed with citizens of Shinjuku, crammed to the point that everybody was standing shoulder to shoulder and cheek to jowl. Unlike the typical breakfast rush, the crowd was almost completely silent and the atmosphere was tense with anxiety. Standing on a chair in front of Ino's office, the side of the room furthest from the street entrance, I could feel the weight of eager eyes in their hundreds pressing down. It was a familiar weight, entirely unintimidating, even if the nervous energy in my audience was almost palpable. Naoto stood on my left and Yoshi, one of the two squad leaders from the mission to Niigata Prefecture, stood on my right. Even with my prop, I was only barely taller than the two men, but every eye was fixed on me. I had tried to get Naoto to take point, to be the one to make the announcement. He was, after all, the Kozuki for which the Kozuki organization was named, as well as the one that had led this community for the last several months. He had demurred, insisting that the announcement would be much more meaningful if it came from me. "You're the prodigal daughter, come back at last," Naoto had pointed out, and also the one who first forged the Rising Sun Association. "Believe it or not, Tanya, you're the one they're going to listen to most closely." "Me? I'm the day-to-day guy. You, on the other hand, are a symbol." I wasn't sure if I bought that excuse or not, but I'd acquiesced. Naoto was my leader, and to be frank, he still looked quite disheveled. Perhaps that had been one of the reasons he'd been so strenuous in his argument that I handled the public speaking. "Brothers and sisters, my fellow citizens of Shinjuku, I wish you a very hearty good morning." My voice carried easily over the room, and the dull mutters ceased almost immediately. Of course, I'd greet any one of you with a hearty morning greeting any day we met, but today is a very good morning indeed. I paused and the crowd stirred, a low buzzing as people wondered aloud to neighbors about what I meant. I let the buzz continue for a few seconds, the anticipation building, before I resumed. "Brothers and sisters, you know me, and I know you. I know how hard we've worked just to survive, how every bowl of soup and every grain of rice is dear, purchased with hours of straining labor in all weather and seasons. I've worked for my food too, always hungry and never satisfied. Nobody will ever say that living in Shinjuku is easy, there are no cushy lives to be found here." The appeal to shared misery and familiar working-class bonds worked. The voice of the crowd murmured of agreement as frowns settled into familiar creases, everybody remembering long shifts of thankless work in the steaming heat of summer or the biting cold of winter. "Yes, life in Shinjuku is hard," I continued, picking up steam, "but there's no shortage of parasites determined to make it a hell of a lot harder than it has to be. You know them too, the bastard landlords charging an arm and a leg for a piece of floor. The foreign thieves whose gentry collect from those bastard landlords and whose commoners content themselves with grabbing anything of ours that they want, and most of all, the petty tyrants who have risen amongst us. The gangs." A rumble of anger echoed forth from deep in the crowd, and frowns of frustration sharpened into angry glowers. The buzzing intensified and heated as 1,000 abuses and tiny miseries came to the minds of all present. "No more," I cried out, lifting a clenched fist above my head, thrusting it upwards in the universal sign of struggle. "No more thieving, no more raping, no more slave-taking or kidnapping. No more extortion, no more murdering, and no more holding all of our arms back and distracting us from our real enemy. A new sun has risen over Shinjuku, brothers and sisters." A sea of fists rose up in solidarity with mine, and the crowd bayed for blood with one voice. Beside me Naoto and Yoshi raised their fists too, knife-like smiles below their hard eyes. "Last night, we killed every last member of the 11 lords, the crowned heads, and the king's men." The crowd almost exploded with howls of celebration, and I had to enhance my voice just a bit so I could shout over them. "Last night, they went the way of the Kokurika and every other gang in Shinjuku. They will never steal from us again, never take without giving back. Most of all, they will no longer act as middlemen, catering to the sick pleasures of our esteemed lords and masters. Rejoice, brothers and sisters," I cried out, pouring even more power into my voice. "Rejoice, and make ready. The sun is rising, and we all must rise to the occasion. Look to your block leaders and to the Council of Notables for daily assignments, for there is still much to do in Shinjuku, but keep your ears open, the call could come at any time. Train well and eat hearty. Work as hard as you can and become strong. The sun will rise on the rest of our native land once more, and we must be ready for that day. I paused, teetering on the edge for a moment, then grinned. Long live Japan. Long live the Japanese people. May they rule for 10,000 years. Banzai. The crowd replied as one, as a people given fresh hope, as a man dying of thirst drinking deep from a crack in a stone leaking cold, pure water. Banzai. Banzai. Long live Japan. Long live Japan. Long live Japan.